Chapter 607. It was around autumn. Red and yellow leaves covered the streets and alleys of Tianjin Planet. Four light green jet cylinders flew past the treetops at a low altitude, like the tip of a pen brushing past the bright colors. Then, they landed at an airport outside the center of the capital city. The group changed to military vehicles and headed toward the center of the city along the spacious high-grade roads that extended in all directions like a spider web. They arrived at their destination in the afternoon. The majestic and cold side door of the palace slowly opened, and a group of guards wearing royal military uniforms walked out. They silently took a moving, self-restraining bed from the fleet and headed into the depths of the palace. The white restraints were like spider silk, tightly binding the thin, weak, and paralyzed young foreigner on the moving bed, making him look like an insect that was about to be sucked to death. Along the way, the Empire's people didn't use equipment to control Su Li's vision and hearing. He was finally able to take a look at this city that only existed in the imagination of the Federation people, the Empire's capital city of Tianjin Planet. The vast maple forest on the outskirts of the city, the extraordinarily wide highways, and the unique architecture all brought him a great shock. It must be known that although the Federation had paid a great price to obtain an image of this huge city, very few people were able to see it with their own eyes. However, all the Federation people who had seen the capital city of Tianjin Planet should be dead, right? Su Li was very clear that no matter what the Emperor's intentions were for summoning him, death was already very close to his body. Being able to see the Empire's capital city before his death and feel the atmosphere that the Federation people would rarely experience in their entire lives, according to his inherent nature, his eyes should emit a greedy and emotional glow. However, there was only calmness in this pair of small eyes today. Even though his heart was shaken when he saw this majestic palace that was known as the most magnificent human building in the universe, he controlled his facial expression extremely well. The Empire's soldiers who were pushing the bed into the depths of the palace noticed the calmness of this Federation captive and couldn't help but have a strange feeling. Su Li narrowed his eyes and looked at the huge cylindrical alloy building that pierced through the clouds in the distance. He guessed that it was probably the palace where the Emperor lived in the rumors. He was shocked again, but the expression on his face became colder and colder. How many truly important moments in a person's life could there be? Marriage, childbirth, funeral. Today, he, a soldier of the Federation, was going to meet the Federation's greatest enemy, the warmongering, arrogant, and cruel Emperor of the Empire. If he didn't pretend now, when would he? At this moment, he missed the wide sunglasses that Zhou Yu had given him. He felt that he should be Du Shaoqing riding the maglev elevator that had long been forced to eliminate by the Federation's Energy Management Committee because of its huge energy consumption. It did not take long for them to reach the sky from the ground of the palace that was full of flowers, trees, and surveillance equipment. It was really the heavens. The sun in the distance moved slowly toward the horizon. The clouds just had a hint of sunset aura. Golden light rose, red, and people seemed to be floating outside the building. It gave people a feeling that they were within reach. Those who lived here day and night, no matter how firm and steady their minds were, would still be moved higher and higher by the distance from the ground and the drifting clouds around them. They would become more and more indifferent. They would become more and more used to looking down on the common people and take it as a lifelong pleasure. With a hint of criticism, the tightly bound Su Li turned his neck with difficulty and retracted his gaze from the clouds outside the palace. He narrowed his eyes and looked into the darkness in front of him, looking at the back figure in the depths of the darkness. That figure belonged to a middle-aged man. He wore a robe and sat on a soft couch. He held a golden sword in his hand and did not look back. A screen blocked in front of the soft couch. There were golden sunflowers painted on it. At this time, the sunset outside the building reflected the golden light, making the screen seem like it was going to burn. The sunflowers seemed like they were going to come to life. However, all of the dim light fell on the middle-aged man's back and became dim. It was because he was the Emperor of the Empire, the man with the greatest power in the universe, that no one in the Federation had ever seen the Emperor's true appearance. They only knew that he was called Huai Fuchai, the 79th Emperor of the Empire's White Hibiscus dynasty, the unmatched monarch of the entire left sky star region. In reality, not even the empire's ordinary nobles and commoners knew what their emperor looked like. Ever since he ascended the throne, he had never appeared in any of the empire's media, nor were there any images leaked out. The Federation's research concluded that this emperor was deliberately maintaining a sense of mystery in front of his subjects. This was to facilitate the protection of the imperial family's shaky rule. In many relatively strange discussions, people even called this emperor and the intelligence chief of the Green Dragon Mountain anti-government army as the two most mysterious people in the universe. Sulu did not believe this. In his opinion, that uncle with a mouth full of rotten teeth was the one who truly deserved the word mysterious. But as a soldier of the Federation, to be able to see the Emperor of the Empire with his own eyes and come into contact with him at such a close distance, how could he not be excited? As the screen of golden sunflowers grew closer and closer, that robed figure grew clearer and clearer. Sulu grew more and more nervous. Ever since he fled Donglin, he had seen many powerful figures with extraordinary auras. He was also a frequent guest at the presidential residence's private banquets. However, for some reason, he always felt that the emperor under that robe gave him a particularly strong sense of oppression. Was it the smell of power or the smell of death? Was it the identity of the emperor or this person himself? Sulu could not tell clearly, but he could be sure that in his entire life, it was probably only when he first saw the war god Li Pifu in Qingqing's military prison that his mind would be shaken like this. Behind the screen stood Huai Chaoshi. In front of the soft couch, there was a white-haired aristocrat of the empire. He was half bowing and softly saying something. The emperor under the robe slowly raised his right arm. This simple movement was enough to stop the millions of soldiers at the same time. The faint mist outside the palace seemed to have paused for a moment. The aristocrat's narration came to an abrupt end. The emperor's voice was a bit low, like a thick book being blown by the wind. "Did you kill Prince Delin?" Sulu did not look at Huai Chaoshi behind the screen. Narrowing his eyes, he stared at the back of the emperor and answered calmly, as if he was answering a small question in a cooking program. "Did you activate the charter on 3320? Yes. Did you kill Prince Carlton? Yes." The emperor did not turn his head. His eyes should have fallen on that old aristocrat. He let out a few strange laughs. "What's the relationship between you and Nasri? Never heard of him." "Well, I heard that his last name was Fengyu over there." The emperor slowly turned around. His face was cold and graceful. Hearing the last question, Su Li's pupils suddenly shrank. He felt that the band around his neck suddenly tightened, making it difficult for him to breathe. Chapter 608. Sulu had always thought that other than the few people in the Lees of Philadelphia, no one in this world knew about the relationship between him and Fengyu. Who would have thought that in the empire countless light years away from his homeland, the emperor in front of him could reveal so many secrets with just one sentence? Huai Chaoshi, who was standing beside the golden sunflower screen, and the white-haired aristocrat in front of the soft couch had a bigger reaction than him. After hearing the name Nasri, Huai Chaoshi, who had always been calm, raised her head in shock. The aristocrat's eyebrows were raised extremely high, and then quickly fell. The empire's military minister, Prince Barrou, was the emperor's brother. The disputes between the royal family and Master Fan's manor were not secrets to him. He knew very well what the name Nasri meant to the emperor. While he was shocked by the relationship between this Federation soldier and Nasri, he also thought sadly that since the emperor let him hear these things, he had probably already made a decision in his heart. Emperor Huai Fuchai slowly stood up, his long robe pouring down like flowing clouds. He ignored the shock of the three people in the room and looked at Prince Barrou expressionlessly. "I originally didn't need to explain Keaton's death to you, but I didn't think that you would be so stupid. You all always said that no one in this world could kill Keaton under such circumstances, so his death must be my scheme, Huai Chaoshi's decision. But now, Nasri's descendant has personally admitted that he killed Keaton. Do you have any new doubts?" Prince Barrou was silent for a long time. Finally, he no longer humbly bent his body and slowly stood up straight. His back was as straight as a pine tree. He looked at Huai Fuchai and said calmly, "Actually, I really don't need to explain. You should know very well that I have always been afraid of you. Keaton's death made my fear into rare courage. But I really didn't think that Nasri was actually still alive and actually had a son. There are many things in this world that people can't imagine, Huai Fuchai replied coldly. Prince Barou smiled bitterly and said, in the end, you just want to convince me. You can rebel against me and try to overthrow my rule. In fact, ever since father chose me as the crown prince, you have been doing this for decades. Huai Fuchai put his hands behind his back, his gaze distant as he gazed at the distant clouds. He said slowly, but I find it very difficult to accept that you would act because of such a stupid reason. I am even more unwilling to bear moral responsibility for something I have never done. Prince Borowski didn't answer anything. He silently tidied up his clothes and then walked to the railing. At the end of the railing, several soldiers were waiting to arrest the mastermind behind the nobles' rebellion. Prince Bo Wu smiled and touched the railing with his wrinkled hand. Then, he shook his head and fell down into the sunset. Huai Fuchai coldly looked at this scene. Seeing his own brother commit suicide by jumping off a building, his expression didn't change at all. Only his eyes that seemed to be able to see through the clouds looked down, as if he was chasing after the figure in the air. The tightly bound Su Lu silently watched all of this. He knew that he had personally witnessed a page of the history of the empire. He didn't know what the truth of this noble's rebellion was, what kind of dangerous assassination the emperor encountered, what kind of valiant suppression of the rebellion, who that old noble was, but he could guess that with the death of that noble, this rebellion finally came to an end. The emperor probably tied him up and brought him into the palace to make these rebellious nobles believe that he had nothing to do with Keaton's death. Su Lu pondered in silence, but he was startled by the burning gaze of the two people. He thought of that question again. From that sentence, it was obvious that the emperor knew the uncle. Could it be that the uncle was really a traitor? He looked up at the middle-aged man in front of him, narrowed his eyes, and asked hoarsely, "Can I know who Nasri is?" The emperor didn't answer his question. Instead, he looked at his face with a complicated expression and asked, "Where is he now?" "He's already dead," Su Lu replied. The emperor was silent for a long time. He waved his sleeve as if to drive away an extremely unpleasant memory and a green fly. He said, "This kind of person should have died long ago. How do you know my relationship with him?" Su Lu suddenly thought of a very fatal problem. If the imperial family knew Feng Yu's ability very well and knew that he had the means to take out the chip behind his neck, then how could they not guard against his escape? Li Pifu, this kind of person, will not have an illegitimate child. Huai Fuchai said indifferently, "And you are also a person of the Federation who knows 8 rice, so you are naturally Nasri's son." Thinking of the conversation between the emperor and the nobleman, Su Lu felt more and more strange. Why did the people of the empire insist that he was Feng Yu's son and not a student? Could it be that, as Huai Chaosher had once said, this strange thing called 8 rice jinshi was really a boring existence of blood theory? This is a very simple inference. What is very interesting is that in the entire universe, there are probably only a few people who can infer it. Huai Fuchai's face was cold and did not appear to be interested. Now my question is, since he is dead, who should I vent the anger that has been accumulating for more than 20 years? A wind came from outside the building, not fierce, not gentle, just cold, such was the atmosphere of the scene. Standing by the screen, Huai Chaosher, who had been silent all this time, suddenly raised his head and looked at his father. It seemed that he wanted to say something, but in the end, his lips were tightly pressed together and he did not say a word. I don't know what happened back then. Su Lu did not explain to the other the true relationship between himself and Feng Yu. He looked at the emperor and narrowed his eyes. As for what you think, it does not have much to do with me. Right now, I am only one of your captives. Huai Fuchai held his hands behind his back and stood silently for a long time, as if he did not hear what he was saying. Then he slowly lowered his body and picked up the old rattan at his feet. The rattan was held tightly, and there were faint traces of old black blood on it. The rattan fell heavily. It did not dance like a flower, but viciously split open the air and then tore at the bandages and restraints on Su Li's body. It tore at his flesh, carrying endless resentment and anger, venting the hatred of a monarch that came from who knew where. There were countless small metal hooks hidden in the rattan. Each swing was like the terrifying kiss of a tiger's tongue, scraping off a thin layer of flesh, causing extreme pain. Huai Fuchai silently and forcefully swung the rattan like a calm madman, whipping the completely paralyzed young man. The sound of wind breaking and the sound of cloth being rolled up mixed together in the palace. Su Li's face was abnormally pale, his eyes abnormally bright. Paralyzed, he should not have felt pain, but this kind of humiliating torture seemed to hurt his heart. The wind whistled past, and a miserable wound appeared on his chin. He did not close his eyes. His bright eyes were round with anger as he stared at the crazy monarch in front of him. He spat out blood and roared, "I'll fuck your mother." Chapter 609. People who were humiliated, tortured, and hurt would occasionally cry out in despair. Pain would make people sob, make people toss and turn, make people bite the corners of their quilts, break out in cold sweat, and lean against the corners of their chairs with yellow faces. Sometimes, it would also make people unable to help themselves from cursing out vulgarities that they would never have cursed under normal circumstances. The merciless and humiliating whipping of the thorns, the bloody marks on his chin and the flying red bandages, stimulated Su Li's heart. Therefore he angrily shouted out a profanity about the emperor's mother. "Fuck your mother." In the vast universe, who dared to say such words to the emperor of the empire? Not being afraid of death was far from enough. That person had to clearly understand that they were going to die. Coincidentally, Su Li met these two conditions. Therefore, he wantonly said those words, pleasing his cold and angry heart and balancing the fear before death. The 4 words that the paralyzed and weak person seemed to have used up all of his strength and energy to burst out were like a clap of thunder, instantly spreading throughout the entire palace. The servants of the empire in the distance looked up in shock. The golden sunflower on the screen nearby turned around and pretended not to hear it. Huai Chaoshi opened her eyes wide and looked at the pale-faced person under the flying thorns in disbelief. She stared at the bloody foam in the air. These words must have clearly reached the ears of the emperor, but his expression did not change in the slightest. The hint of madness in his indifferent and graceful appearance continued, and the thorns in his hand continued to fall down one after another, landing on Su Li's body, venting his many years of frustration. The emperor stared at Su Li, who was tightly bound, but the gaze in his eyes seemed to pass through his face to the face from countless years ago, the 2 faces. The thorns in his hand swung down slowly and steadily in a gentle but heart-palpitating rhythm, breaking through flesh, splashing blood, and bringing pain. That person was already dead, and the resentment of the past could no longer find a target for revenge. Just like the rosy clouds in the sky, the bright moon in the water, and the sunflower in the mirror, how could they be satisfied without any real feedback? As a result, he placed all of the resentment that no one knew about on the thorns, landing on the body of this Federation youth in front of him, turning them into blood that splattered everywhere. Because you are his descendant. The vines fell directly, as if to whip some kind of cowardice in the heart. The Emperor Huai Fuchai's expression was indifferent, the madness in his eyes gradually receding, becoming increasingly cold. "Fuck your mother." Su Li also widened his eyes and stared at the Emperor of the Imperium, who was right in front of him. Every time his body was hit by a thorn, his grayish-white thin lips would open and repeat the same profanity. Compared to the first time, his voice was much weaker, but it was still clear enough for the Emperor in front of him and Huai Chaoshi beside him to hear it clearly. With a bang, the ratchet fell down. "Fuck your mother." With another bang, the ratchet fell down again. "Fuck your mother again." As many as the ratchet fell down, "I'll fuck your mother again." Fuck is a kind of attitude towards life. This is a kind of attitude of not lowering one's head, not blinking, not narrowing one's eyes, only staring at you, unyielding, unavoiding, and fearless. Even if you are the most powerful person in the universe, even if you can make millions of people shed blood into rivers with a single word, you still can't not let me fuck you. You can use a red iron needle to sew my mouth shut, but I can use my finger to write a large fuck character. You can cut off all of my 10 fingers, but I can still silently chant the bright fuck character in my heart. Of course, you can kill me, But since death is already here, why not fuck me a few more times before death? The emperor didn't have anyone seal his mouth, only lowering his head slightly, as if he was carrying out some kind of ritual, slowly and forcefully whipping his body. Su Lu also lowered his head slightly, staring straight at his face, as if returning some kind of courtesy, slowly, softly, and forcefully uttering a curse. Pa fuck your mother at the time, the situation in the royal palace was like this. The great emperor and the brave Federation hero, because of the unique part of each other's temperament, became two seemingly expressionless but, in reality, unusually crazy fighting cocks with black and red coxcombs raised their necks and looked with disdain at the world and the other side, carrying out a childlike confrontation with each other using one curse word after another. The trembling imperial servants and female officials kneeling outside the palace would find it difficult to forget the scene they saw today for a long time in the future. In reality, at the time, they thought that after hearing the countless dirty curses of the Federation madman toward the emperor's mother, they would certainly be immediately executed to prevent the filth from spreading to more people's ears. Unexpectedly, the emperor didn't execute them afterward. Perhaps it was because the emperor was too tired. The blood-soaked bandages fluttered in all directions like the feathers of a bird. They then fell and spread out around Su Li's body in a large area. Some of the blood had solidified into black paint, while others were as bright as new blood. There was even more blood that flowed out from the large and small wounds on his body and dripped down his thighs to the ground. It was an unusually terrifying sight. Su Li did not faint. Because of the excessive blood loss, his cheeks were unusually pale. A trace of indifference and ruthlessness still hung on his face. His head drooped weakly, but his eyes were still forcefully open. He stared viciously at the emperor in front of him. It looked like he was rolling his eyes in disdain. Huai Fuchai's right hand held the whip tightly. There was a trace of loneliness in his cold expression. Under the robe, his chest rose and fell continuously. The long period of whipping seemed to have used up a lot of the emperor's strength. His gaze was still calm, but there was an additional trace of complicated and indescribable emotion in his expression. He looked silently at the bloody man in front of him and listened to the last curse word that was so slightly hoarse that it was almost inaudible. Suddenly, his brows furrowed and he let go of his right hand. The blood-stained whip fell into the pool of blood and bloomed with a few blossoms of blood. Huai Fuchai silently turned around and walked past the giant golden sunflower screen. He walked back to the dark and noble soft couch. Gently brushing his robe, he calmly sat down. He stared blankly at the large classical brick wall. He seemed to be somewhat tired. Then he raised his hand and waved it tiredly. Two fingers cut through the air, deciding Su Li's life and death. In the sea of mulberry trees, you gave me some surprises, but compared to that, today I feel even more admiration. Outside the maglev elevator, Huai Chaosher looked at the blood-covered Su Li. After a moment of silence, he said, "I am very sorry. The dignity I once promised has been a little unexpected today. However, I can guarantee that you will die by execution and not by torture." The half-lying Su Li struggled to open his swollen eyes. He wanted to say something, but in the end, he could only weakly spit out a few drops of blood. He could only helplessly smile. Huai Chaosher took a handkerchief from a subordinate's hand and helped him wipe away the blood at the corner of his mouth. The Empire's medical team had already rushed over. Large doses of cardiac stimulants and muscle relaxants were injected into Su Li's body. The smell of the medical glue, for a short time, actually covered up the fragrance of the flowers in the royal palace. After a period of treatment, Su Li finally recovered some of his energy. In a raspy voice, he said in a low voice, "Just now, seeing your emperor's hand gesture, I should be immediately executed. Why are you still treating me?" I said, "I will let you die with dignity." Huai Chaosher furrowed his brows slightly and replied, "I cannot stop the emperor's anger, but before you die, you will certainly enjoy the treatment a soldier deserves." "I won't say thank you." Su Li's eyes were so swollen that only a slit remained. He looked at Huai Chaosher's face through the slit and suddenly remembered a derogatory proverb from the Federation. In a raspy voice, he said, Because I won't express any thanks to those who want to kill me. If you had the chance to kill me, what would you do? Huai Chaoshu asked. Of course I would kill you. Su Li's reply was very honest. In the foreseeable future, the princess in front of him was, without a doubt, the most powerful and terrifying enemy of the Federal Army. If there was a chance to eliminate her from history ahead of time, no Federation soldier would hesitate in the slightest, even if she was a young woman. Huai Chaoshu smiled. To be able to prove one's ability from the mouth of the most outstanding enemy officer, one's mood was not too bad. Before you die, what words do you have to say? In the future, when the Empire occupies the Federation, I can pass on your words to the people of the Federation. The Empire occupies the Federation? The weak Su Lu was not in the mood to continue arguing with her. He blinked with difficulty and asked, Are these my last words? When did the Empire treat the captives of the Federation so well? This is to thank you for bringing back the diary of that officer, Huai Chaoshu replied. Was he going to give out his last words again? Su Lu thought of the conversation he had with Bai Yulan on the summit of White Cliff Peak at 3,320 years ago. A trace of emotion appeared on his wounded and miserable face. After a long silence, he looked at Huai Chaoshu and said in a raspy voice, I don't have any last words. I just want to know what Feng Yu, that Nasri you all speak of, what is his relationship with the Empire? He is one of the people closest to me in my life. The government said that he is a traitor, and the charter determined that he is the #1 wanted criminal, but I don't believe it. Su Lu painfully coughed a few times. He gasped for breath and said, Your emperor hates him very much. This is very good. He supports my rebellion. This matter is truly very important to me. Hearing Su Li's last request before his death, Huai Chaoshu was also silent for a long time. The fingers behind her moved slightly, chasing away all of the doctors and guards. Only the two of them were left in the secluded corner of the royal palace. The Federation believes that he is a traitor? An extremely strong trace of mockery appeared at the corners of her lips. Things in this world are truly very strange. In my opinion, your father and Li Pifu, this pair of brothers, are, without a doubt, the most shameless pair of traitors in the history of the Empire. Su Li's body should be very weak after being crazily whipped by the thorns. His hearing was somewhat damaged. The blood that flowed down his temples gradually coagulated when it entered his ears. The sounds of the outside world seemed even more indistinct. He tilted his head slightly with difficulty, wanting to clearly hear what Huai Chaoshu was saying. Uncle Feng Yu and military god Li Pifu were traitors to the Empire? Or did he hear wrong? Fuck. Chapter 610. A few years ago, in the mech combat training room in Section H1 of the Yue University Library, Su Lu used the channel of burning energy to replace the nerves and veins in his body, transmitting the instructions from his brain to every part of his body. From that day on, he became one of the most thick-skinned people in the universe. Until now, when the channel collapsed, the burning energy was still wandering in his body, and his nerves were even thicker than before. Therefore, many things that could shock ordinary people to the point of prostrating themselves on the ground or even trembling all over could not shake his stubborn heart that was as dull as a stone. Being whipped crazily by the Emperor was a rare treatment, but it didn't shock him. He was weak and paralyzed, and he was brutally beaten until he was covered in blood. His wounds were so horrible that even though you might not be able to recognize him, but he was still able to smile. He didn't care, and he wasn't shocked at all. Even when the Emperor revealed the secret he had buried for a long time, the secret between him and Uncle Feng Yu, the surprise in his heart calmed down, and there wasn't much shock left in him. Until now, when he heard Huai Chaoshu's words full of mockery and resentment, he was finally shocked and could not speak for a long time. The god of war Li Pifu galloped in the universe, shining brightly and reaching the peak of personal strength, almost like a god. Uncle Feng Yu's body shook, fighting against more than 10 military mechs with his bare hands. He was so strong that it was dazzling. No one knew when this pair of brothers suddenly appeared in the Federation, showing their extraordinary strength in different fields and light and shadow, fighting against the glory of the Empire and the Charter. However, their ability was not passed down. No matter how many close combat masters there were in the Philadelphia cultivation gym, even geniuses like Mr. Tian, no one could approach the level of the brothers. According to Huai Chaoshi, the jinqi that Uncle Feng taught him should be called 8 rice, and this jinqi was the secret ability of the imperial family. It seemed that this was enough to explain many things. They are from the empire? Su Le did not need to squint his swollen eyes to express his inner feelings as usual. He stared at Huai Chaoshi in front of him and asked in an incredulous tone after a long silence. Huai Chaoshi narrowed her eyes and said, "Fortunately or unfortunately, the people of the empire can hardly learn the ingratitude of the people of the Federation." Su Lu understood this sentence and suddenly felt a wave of relief mixed with lingering fear. If the Federation's war god and his teacher were really brothers of the empire, he really found it hard to accept this absurd fact. However, following Huai Chaoshi's denial, even more questions poured into his mind. If the brothers Li Pifu were not from the empire, where did they learn their amazing abilities? Why was the imperial family so familiar with Uncle Feng Yu's incarnation? It was almost evening, and the red clouds were flying diagonally outside the high palace walls. The faint golden afterglow shone through those unknown trees and sprinkled on this quiet corner. They came to the empire to study? When did that happen? Su Li's mechanic mode of thinking was calm enough and precise enough to immediately grasp the core of the problem. Nasri definitely came to the empire when he was young, but the story between him and His Majesty should not be known by anyone in this universe. As for Li Pifu, there is no evidence to prove that before he led the army to invade the empire, he came to planet Tianjing to study. "I don't understand," Su Lu said hoarsely, his voice extremely weak. Huai Chaoshi glanced at him, shook her head, and said, "You're about to die, why are you still concerned about this?" "It's because I'm about to die that I have the urge to know these secrets." Su Lu coughed and replied, "I don't want to die with 800 question marks in my head. A hungry ghost is uncomfortable, but a curious ghost is even more uncomfortable." "Yes, you're about to die." After a moment of silence, Huai Chaoshi said, "There's no harm in letting you know about the past of your father and uncle. Maybe you'll understand why the empire is angry." "This must be a very long story." Su Lu smiled with difficulty. "I don't know if I can finish listening to it before I die. I don't know much about the details of what happened back then." Huai Chaoshi looked at him and pressed the electric button beside the self-restraining table. She said expressionlessly, "This is a very simple story. It's always good to have a story to listen to before you die." Huai Chaoshi returned to silence and walked towards a corner of the palace. The self-restraining table that bound Su Lu made a low electric sound and followed his back as he moved forward, walking further and further away under the bright red sunset. The Empire's military officers and doctors behind did not hear the conversation between the two of them. They looked at the two long and narrow backs that were gradually moving away and could not help but look at each other. Then, they quietly followed from afar. This scene was very interesting. A death row prisoner wrapped in restraints, bandages, and medical glue like a Nanling specialty brown rice bag was like a paralyzed old man who could not walk. He leaned against the self-restraining table and followed the young man in front of him who had his hands behind his back. His body was thin but gave off an aura that was more valiant than the huge palace. They slowly walked under the high palace walls in the twilight. It was like two people who appreciated each other were saying goodbye. It was a farewell. "Do you see that building?" Huai Chaoshi stood on the high palace wall and squinted at the civilian district in the west shrouded in the twilight. She pointed at a completely white courtyard in the midst of the low residential buildings. Su Li's eyes were swollen. He looked with difficulty for a long time and then nodded. He did not know what the little story before his death had to do with that inconspicuous courtyard. That is the most sacred place in the entire empire other than the imperial palace. Huai Chaoshi had a leisurely expression. "The Great Master Fan Manor." "The Great Master Fan Manor?" Su Lu silently repeated this strange name in his mind. He felt like he had heard of it somewhere before. The Great Teacher is the most respected title in the empire, but not many people know about it because they do not care about the reputation in the secular world. Why Chausher slowly explained, every great teacher is a rare genius. Perhaps it is in the academic field, the economic field, or some other field. In short, they are the most secret and also the most important foundation of the empire. You mean? Su Lu was confused and asked, this position is hereditary? Correct. A family that always produces geniuses? After a moment of silence, Su Lu shook his head with difficulty and said, I am a member of the Federation. I believe in equality. I do not believe that fate itself will create this kind of unfairness. There has never been such a thing as innate fairness in the universe. Why Chausher said indifferently, only those with royal blood have the chance to master the 8 rice true chi. This is unfair, but it is also the truth. So you have to admit that the Creator has chosen the royal family to lead the ordinary people of the empire from the beginning. The war god and the Nasri brothers are not people of the empire, so naturally, it is impossible for them to have royal blood. I am also not from the empire, but we have both mastered it. Why Chausher narrowed his eyes, seemingly troubled by this question. After a long silence, he said, perhaps the Creator has chosen you and the Li brothers on your side. Should I feel honored? Su Lu shook his head. You should feel honored. Why Chausher gave a simple comment and said directly, now, let us begin the simple story. Please. After or before the Empire and the Federation met, an Empire spaceship passed through the space channel and entered the Federation's territory, landing in a place called Feiqing. Wait, there are many logical problems at the beginning of this simple story. Su Lu did not care about his weak body and firmly retorted, the Empire's space technology was even more backward than it is now. It was not enough to support a spaceship to cross the galaxy. Besides, even if that spaceship flew over, it would not have been able to hide from charter and silently land in the capital ring. As I said, I don't know too many details. I just want to tell a simple story. Why Chausher stood in the twilight, frowning as if a fire was about to ignite. She was not used to this guy being so stubborn even before death. And I firmly believe that the spaceship can do it, because this is the foundation of the story, because the passenger on the spaceship is the former great teacher. Su Lu was silent for a long time before saying, all right, what's the end of the story? The former great teacher of the Empire found a pair of brothers who could cultivate the 8 rice true chi in the Federation's Feiqing, so he taught them. At that time, the pair of brothers were still children. They were pure enough and talented enough. They grew up very quickly, so quickly that they surpassed the great teacher's imagination. The problem was that when they grew up, they were no longer pure. The older brother changed his name to Li Pifu and participated in the invasion of the Empire, completely ignoring the fact that the Empire was his teacher's hometown. Then one day, this man called Li Pifu assassinated the Emperor of the Empire. In that battle, he even used the 8 rice true chi he had learned in the Empire to kill his teacher. And then? There's no then. The setting sun outside the palace walls was like a crack in Su Li's eyes, from which countless streams of blood flowed. Huai Caosher's simple words described a major event that had happened several decades ago. Perhaps this major event would never be recorded in history, but that great teacher who was far away from the Empire, those 2 ignorant children who were learning true chi in Feiqing, had personally written a few lines of words in history that could never be erased. In this simple story, there was the former great teacher's inconceivable journey into space, the integration and separation of races, the friendly teaching and ruthless betrayal, and the great psychological struggle and painful torment of races. There was also blood. This is truly an extraordinary story. Su Lu knew that she had no reason to lie to him at this moment. Although there were still countless questions that had not been answered, just this information alone was enough to make him shocked again and again, perplexed again and again. Chapter 611. Decades ago, even in the last constitutional calendar, an ordinary private spaceship swayed alone through countless stars and dust, through the complex and dangerous space channel of the Night Scorpion Nebula, and mistakenly entered a completely unfamiliar galaxy. Somehow, it avoided the omnipresent the glory of the Charter and came to the Federation, which had been in peace for thousands of years. It was so quiet that it was about to decay. At that time, the Federation, the first generation of anti-government forces without any political program had just taken shape in the Green Dragon Mountain. The leader of Nanshui had not been born yet, and he should not have been born yet. This group of workers who escaped from factories in the 4 states around the mountains only had wrenches and heavy loading machines in their hands and other weapons in their hands. At that time, the Federation, the 7,000-year-old families gradually hid their huge bodies behind the scenes of the historical truth. The government and the management committee became stronger and stronger, and the strength of the federal military was as scattered and weak as it had been in the past tens of thousands of years. Because there was no enemy, the West Mountain compound was a forgotten corner of the people. At that time, the Federation was a peaceful society. People enthusiastically praised the countless different styles of Master Schiller's plays, and were content to find excitement from those bizarre and strange stories to pass the time of their stagnant lives. At the same time, they also balanced the boredom caused by years of eating synthetic protein meat. At that time, in the Federation, the Zhong family controlled the 4th military region in the West Woods, carefully keeping a distance from the Federation government. In the more distant East Woods region, the lack of crystal resources forced the enterprises under the Tai family to increase the speed of excavation in the deep crust of the earth. From time to time, uncontrollable mining accidents accompanied by small earthquakes occurred in this troubled land. A spaceship from the Empire quietly landed in such a federation. The young man walked out of the spaceship curiously and excitedly looked at everything new around him. There was a small device in his jacket pocket that kept emitting faint blue light. The young man from the Empire hid his identity, avoiding the glory of the Charter and wandering or traveling in the Federation. No one knew where he went and how long he stayed. They could only guess that at some point in time, he saw 2 young boys under the reflection of the snow mountain in a place called Feiqing, a place that had now been designated as a forbidden area by the Federation government. The 2 boys' surnames were Li. The young man from the Empire was pleasantly surprised to find that the 2 boys could actually sense qi. For some reason that no one knew, he chose to stay in a foreign and incomprehensible city to personally educate the 2 boys. Many years later, the young man from the Empire became a middle-aged man with a green beard. Homesick, he returned to his hometown. Many years later, the flames of war between the Federation and the Empire continued. After a night of painful psychological struggle, the 2 brothers chose a completely different direction in life. Because the way they treated war and the way they treated their teacher was completely different from the way they treated betrayal of kindness, these 2 equally brilliant and moving brothers had an intense quarrel and even a fight. Their palms fell down, their teeth bit their tongues, and they were shaken to the ground with blood. Ever since then they had fallen out. The elder brother wiped away his pained expression and changed his name to join the military. He entered the 1st military region as a 17 mechanic. He wore a military uniform and piloted a mechanical suit, beginning a dazzling career as a military god. The younger brother wiped away his lonely expression and quietly disappeared into the sea of people. From then on, the Federation had 1 less mechanical genius, but the capital university had 1 more historical and political scientist. After a few years of blankness, the Federation Society had gained many more extraordinary characters. When the Federal Army entered the Empire's territory, a fierce battle broke out. Li Pifu rushed thousands of miles. That black M37 mecha was on the verge of collapse. Like a bolt of lightning, it blasted into the depths of the Empire's military camp that was heavily protected by countless Empire's royal mecha, causing an explosion that changed the direction of the battle. The explosion stirred up a cloud of dust. The Emperor of the Empire fell to the ground with an expression of disbelief. Beside him, an old man looked at the approaching shadow of the mecha with a complicated and inexplicable gaze until it was reduced to ashes. This old man had once been young. He had once traveled the universe. He had once taught 2 little boys in a puzzling city in the Federation. Many years later, he had inexplicably died at the hands of one of the little boys. At that time, in the dimly lit cockpit of the mecha, what kind of expression would Li Pifu have on his face? After knowing this, what kind of expression would Feng Yu have on his face? After a few more years, Li Pifu, who had already become the Federation's military god, led the Federal Army in a large-scale attack on the Empire. However, because of that strange explosion, all of his previous efforts had been wasted. What did this have to do with Feng Yu's expression back then? Was this how the #1 wanted criminal of the Federation, the #1 traitor of the Empire, was trained? In the blood-red twilight, Su Lu, bound by restraints, narrowed his eyes and looked into the distance. His face full of red and swollen wounds looked somewhat comical, but at this moment, it was shrouded in a layer of seriousness and even solemnity. Ink painting needed to be left blank. Life also needed blank. Huai Chaosher had told an extremely simple story, but his mind automatically filled in the blanks left behind. Countless scenes flashed before his eyes like they were real. He was inexplicably shocked, and his heart was filled with endless emotions. What was history? This was true history. Those secret scrolls of the magnificent era gradually unfolded before his eyes. Moreover, these scrolls were also related to him. How could he not be moved? Under the Twilight Palace walls, there was a long silence. Huai Chaosher quietly looked at the luster on his face, experiencing the emotions in his heart at this moment. She suddenly felt a faint emotion in her heart. This great teacher, he must be an extraordinary person. A hoarse voice finally broke the silence on the palace walls. Su Lu narrowed his eyes and looked at the conspicuous white courtyard in the distant commoner district. Someone who could enter the Federation alone and avoid the glory of the Charter was obviously not simple. What was even more frightening was that he was actually able to teach Li Pifu and Uncle Feng Yu, these two terrifying powerhouses. Huai Chaosher didn't answer with her hands behind her back. In the eyes of the Empire's royal family, those fellows from the Great Teacher Fan Manor never needed to be suspected. But I still have a question. There is no way to find the answer from this story. Su Lu turned his head with difficulty and asked in a hoarse voice, "Why does your father hate Nasri so much?" Huai Chaosher slowly closed her slightly narrowed eyes. In the gradually cooling night wind, she pondered for a long time. She thought about the anger her father had when he launched the attack on the West Woods, the anger today, that Federation national girl and the metal bracelet on her wrist. I don't know. She paused for a moment and suddenly said, "The Empire's royal family has been connected by marriage with the Great Teacher Fan Manor for generations. My mother is the youngest daughter of the former Great Teacher Fan, but I heard that she died many years ago." Vaguely, Su Lu always felt that Huai Chaosher's words revealed a trace of quiet emotion, as if she wanted to say something but couldn't say it. The setting sun in the distance fell a little lower, but the sunset in the sky was a little thicker. The twilight on the palace walls was even thicker. He looked at Huai Chaosher's pair of black eyebrows that were about to completely burn on her delicate face and said, "Thank you for telling me this before I die. Yes, and thank you for telling me those secrets on the spaceship, although it seems that I can't win this bet." Thinking of the bet with Su Lu without words, Huai Chaosher's eyebrows raised slightly, and she smiled but didn't say anything. When it was time to say goodbye to each other, the two of them were the best of the younger generation in the Federation and the Imperium. They were destined to be enemies who could not live under the same sky, but they had fought together, escaped together, and talked to each other. "After you die, I might be even lonelier. This is indeed a regret." Huai Chaosher narrowed her eyes and said calmly, "You won't be lonely for too long." Su Lu understood what she meant. He also narrowed his eyes and looked at the sunset on the horizon. He said with a difficult smile, "In the future, you will meet a guy called Li Feng. He's younger than you and me, but when it comes to mecha combat, he's actually stronger than me." "The legendary madman Li? With your endorsement, I don't think I'll be too disappointed." Huai Chaosher said expressionlessly, "But I regret that I can't fight with you. After you die, it'll probably be difficult to find another partner in this universe who can fight with me." Yes, the feeling of fighting side by side with Sang Shuhai is really not bad. Su Lu paused for a moment and then smiled. "But the question is, if we work together, who has the right to be our enemy? No one. Humanity has never encountered a truly hostile intelligent species in the universe." Huai Chaosher suddenly raised the hand behind her back and stretched lazily in the twilight. She said calmly, "So we can only fight with ourselves? We're all humans. Both sides know this very well. But neither side will admit it unless one side completely defeats the other. Why bother? Su Lu shook his head. Our generation probably doesn't have the wisdom to solve this problem. Let's leave it to future generations. Huai Chaoshi also shook her head. The twilight was as red as blood. Huai Chaoshi looked at his tragic face and nodded slightly. Goodbye. I understand. This means we'll meet again in the next life. Su Lu smiled and nodded. Huai Chaoshi stood on the wall and watched the back of that figure being escorted away by the Empire's soldiers. Her brows slowly furrowed. This fellow who clearly knew he was going to die did not have the slightest trace of madness. He was actually so curious about the past. After knowing the answer, he was so satisfied and smiled so sincerely. Unless one had a pure heart that had been washed by the clear spring of the snowy mountains for 1,000 years, who else could do this? Watching that figure disappear into the twilight, she suddenly thought of the words engraved on the stone wall of Great Master Fan's manor. The future of those with pure hearts is boundless. She had spent her childhood and the first few years of her adolescence in Great Master Fan's manor. She had never liked these words with a sour and literary tone. She had silently cursed them countless times, but today she suddenly felt that these words were somewhat reasonable. It was indeed easy for pure people to become strong. She stood in the night wind on the palace wall, silently thinking for a long time. Only when the twilight completely disappeared and the darkness enveloped the houses and the white courtyard did she slowly raise her head. At this moment, an imperial major ran over and heavily kneeled on the ground. With a trembling voice, he said, "Your Highness, he ran away." Chapter 6:12. In the instant that Huai Chaoshi raised her head, she was lamenting over Su Li's death. In her noble and lonely life, there was one less opponent who was qualified to be her enemy. As a rare person with sufficient strength and qualifications to sigh so deeply that no one would feel disgust or ridicule, in an instant, this sigh of regret quickly transformed into a firm determination. The late emperor and the great teacher had both died at the hands of Li Pifu. My life's goal is to defeat Li Pifu. Even if he is old and bedridden, I must still defeat him. The night wind blew in her face. Just as she was filled with lofty aspirations, she saw the officer run over in a panic and fall to his knees. She heard the officer say in a trembling voice, "Your Highness, he ran away." Huai Chaoshi furrowed her brows and narrowed her eyes. Just like how Su Lu had doubted her hearing a few minutes ago, she also began to doubt her ears. Her Highness was naturally talking about her, but who was he who ran away? Her furrowed brows suddenly rose, and a trace of coldness appeared in her narrowed eyes. She had clearly confirmed that his meridians were all broken and his entire body was paralyzed. Today, he had been beaten to such a weak state by the emperor. How could he run away under the escort of a group of fully armed soldiers? Huai Chaoshi walked down. Her military uniform was stiff and full of murderous intent. She slapped the officer heavily to the ground and scolded in a deep voice, "Useless thing." The officer struggled to stand up and once again lowered his head and knelt at her feet, not daring to make the slightest argument. Location. She quickly walked out of the palace and took the communication device from the hands of her subordinate. She knew that this news should have already reached her father's ears. Jinghua Lake, a spaceship has crashed. The escaping soldiers report that the prisoner is not in the cabin. The nearest guard battalion has already rushed over. The officer stood up and didn't even bother to pat the dust on his knees. He staggered behind her and reported in as concise and accurate a language as possible. Inform the Royal Transportation Department to close all docks and stations. Inform all district defense offices to turn on all chip scanning devices. Order the 2nd Royal Mecha Battalion to rush to Jinghua Lake as quickly as possible. Huai Chaoshi walked forward quickly. Using the equipment in her hands, she issued her orders to all the important departments on Tianjin planet. Her expression was unusually cold. She did not know why Su Lu suddenly had the ability to move, nor did she understand why the bomb on his shoulder did not explode. A faint worry surfaced in her heart. After a moment, she regained her composure. Thinking of the chip behind that guy's neck, She took a deep breath and said expressionlessly, "Send out all the ground troops in the Weishu district. I want no one to miss anything within a 40-square-kilometer radius of Jinghua Lake. The focus of the search is the forest in the south. Advance in echelons and kill them all." The chips on the back of the Federation people's necks were like lights in the dark night. The buildings in the Empire District were densely packed with chip pulse monitoring devices to guard against Federation spies. Under such circumstances, if Sulu wanted to escape, the only way was to leave the city and enter the deep mountains and forests. A few minutes ago, the 4 jets at the belly of the near-surface spaceship developed by the Empire continuously spat out high-pressure air, driving the spaceship away from the setting sun quickly and steadily. It brushed past the tall ancient triangular maple trees and flew towards its destination in the south of Tianjin planet's capital. The bright yellow and red leaves retreated quickly outside the window, blending into the last of the blood-red twilight and returning to darkness. Sulu, who was completely bound, sat quietly in the middle cabin near the cockpit. He looked at the beautiful scenery on the ground through the glass window in silence. No one knew what he was thinking about. The Empire soldiers in charge of escorting him knew that this Federation captive was about to be executed, so they did not care about his silence at this moment. Although they knew that this person was completely paralyzed, the soldiers still strictly followed the safety regulations. For elite special forces, soldiers stared at him from all 4 directions. There were no guns around them. At the front and back of the long and narrow cabin were dozens of fully armed soldiers. Even if the completely paralyzed Sulu suddenly went on a killing spree, he would not be able to grab a weapon and would immediately be turned into a pile of meat paste by the dense rain of bullets. The spaceship vibrated slightly as it flew silently. The night outside the window grew darker and darker, especially when the horizon in the distance was already as dark as ink. Only the lake still shone like a beautiful gem. Sulu quietly looked at the lake that was getting closer and closer. When he came, he had specially paid attention to this lake. He had calculated the difference between the spaceship and the lake, the speed of the spaceship, the reaction speed of the Empire soldiers, his own speed, and many, many other calculations. Calculating was for the sake of calculating, and risking his life was for the sake of survival. He would be executed in a moment. If he did not fight now, when would he? Thus, he narrowed his eyes and looked at the Empire soldier with a cold expression in front of him. He smiled and then lowered his head. The movement of lowering his head seemed ordinary and gentle, but just as his chin was about to touch his chest, he suddenly raised his head and pushed back. With a few shattering sounds, the restraints shattered. The back of Su Li's head smashed through the table and smashed into the forehead of the Empire soldier behind him. Almost at the same time, the bandages that tightly bound his body suddenly tightened. The hard synthetic fibers seemed to be affected by some kind of huge force and rapidly stretched as if they were about to break. Sulu narrowed his swollen eyes and quickly lowered his head, slamming his head into the Empire soldier who was about to open his mouth and shout. Head to the left, head to the right. 4 dull and terrifying sounds of skulls shattering rang out. The 4 Empire Special Forces soldiers around him did not even have time to make a sound before their skulls shattered and they slid to the ground limply. At this time, the restraints on Su Li's body finally broke. Countless snowflake-like fragments of the dense fiber bands sputtered like a huge snowball bursting open. Amidst the flying bandages, his body turned into a black shadow and pounced forward with a roar. His feet stepped on the cabin wall, leaving a faint footprint on the alloy wall. His right hand seemed to have casually swept, and the heavy metal chair that he had calculated beforehand was in his hand. With a shake of his right arm, the scorching power that was wandering all over his body suddenly converged into an extremely powerful force. Accompanied by a violent roar, he threw the metal chair in his hand over. His speed was already extremely fast. This throw that contained the power he had been hiding for many days turned the metal chair into a stream of metal light. It cut through the air with a shrill sound and rushed forward at high speed, smashing into the group of armed soldiers. Countless pieces of flesh and blood burst out. The power was comparable to that of a cannonball. The distance of 7 meters was covered in an instant. With a loud bang, The heavy metal chair smashed into the cockpit door, creating a cloud of smoke and dust. Su-Lu followed closely behind and ruthlessly kicked down. Because he used too much strength, the wound on his face at this moment burst open a little. Drops of blood splashed out. His facial features were extremely ruthless and looked extremely terrifying that in the end, the Empire soldiers responsible for guarding him were too relaxed. No one would have thought that a person who was judged by His Highness to be completely paralyzed could actually go on a rampage and kill people. He clearly looked very weak before, but once he went on a rampage, he was like a crazy tiger. It was not until Su-Lu violently blasted open a bloody path with the chair and kicked open the cockpit that the Empire soldiers in the spaceship finally reacted and raised the guns in their hands. It had to be admitted that the reaction of the Empire soldiers at this moment perfectly displayed excellent military training and terrifying discipline. Seeing that the target was about to enter the cockpit, all the Empire soldiers who raised their guns did not seem to have considered the consequences of firing in the spaceship that would cause everyone to die together. They pulled the trigger without hesitation. Poof, 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 poof. Some of the bullets penetrated the alloy walls, while others bounced off and poured into the narrow cockpit like a torrential rain. Even though they knew that they would die, they still had to open fire because Su-Lu had already entered the cockpit. They could not give him any chance to control the spaceship to force a landing. Su-Lu never had the extravagant hope of being able to steal a spaceship and escape in front of a group of elite Empire soldiers. From the very beginning of the plan, his goal was very simple. It was not to steal the spaceship, but to destroy it. He slashed the pilot who was taking out his pistol with one hand, smashed the autopilot with one elbow, and stepped on the bottom of the control stick with one foot. Under the high-speed rain of bullets, he completed these three actions with lightning speed. He immediately shrunk his body under the seat and firmly pressed his left foot down. After the control stick was stepped on to the bottom, the four jets on the abdomen of the spaceship instantly adjusted their postures, and the power was increased to the maximum. The spaceship shook violently, and its head fiercely accelerated downward. The violent shaking and the sudden dive caused most of the bullets fired by the Empire soldiers behind the cabin to hit the top. The sharp bullets easily penetrated the cabin walls, revealing countless small holes, like the stars in the night sky, like sesame seeds on a sesame seed cake. The subsequent development was completely in line with Su-Lu's calculations. The high-speed diving spaceship tore through the tall maple trees by the lakeside, and after 2 seconds, it resolutely rushed into the clear and open lake. The near-surface spaceship did not fly high, so the time between Su-Lu's violent jump and falling into the lake was extremely short. However, when the heavy spaceship suddenly collided with the cold lake water, it still caused a huge water column and a terrifying loud noise. Diving into the lake at such a high speed, there was not much difference between the soft water surface and the hard concrete floor. The heavy alloy hull let out a sorrowful sound as it twisted and sank to the bottom of the lake along with the turbulent waves around it. The spaceship was destroyed. The Imperial soldiers in the cabin were sent flying in all directions by the tremendous impact before crashing heavily onto the ground. Some were unconscious, some were groaning in grievous wounds, and some were staring blankly at the lake water pouring in through the shattered windows. An officer's eyes were full of despair. He used the last of his strength to press the electronic bomb button at his waist, but there was no explosion as he expected in the cockpit. The lake water instantly submerged his body, washing away the blood he spat out. There was no one in the cockpit. People were dead. Su-Lu began to flee. Chapter 613. Like an arrow and a fish, a human figure drew a white line and plunged into the depths of the cold, dark lake. The tremendous force from the crashed spaceship was clearly reflected in this straight line. A few bubbles overflowed from the top of the figure did not have time to float before they were crushed by the fierce invisible waves. At this time, it was already late at night. The autumn lake water was bone-chillingly cold, hitting one's face painfully. The medical glue was diluted, and there were traces of blood seeping out. However, like those bubbles, they quickly merged into the lake water, and no traces could be found. The tremendous pressure from all directions invaded him, but Su-Lu's miserable face did not show any reaction. He was very used to this environment. After sinking and suffocating in the hundreds of millions of tons of lake water on the Red Rose countless times, he was no longer afraid of water, only a sense of closeness with peace. He struggled to open his swollen eyes and swam to the bottom of the lake, holding the box he picked up from somewhere. He did not move, but his waist occasionally swayed like a fish, and his speed that was just slowed down by the lake water would increase again. When he touched a big rock at the bottom of the lake, he closed his lips and slowly adjusted his posture. He put his obviously stiff left leg into the crack of the rock and wedged his body so that he would not float up. Then he quickly opened the toolbox in his hand and took out a small device. He slowly turned his head and looked at the electrically controlled bomb ring in the bloody hole on his left shoulder. The high-speed rotating probe did not make any buzzing sound at the bottom of the lake, only a few beautiful water swirls. 10 seconds, 20 seconds. Sulu looked up and squinted at the lake. He could vaguely see lights flashing and the huge spiral arms of helicopters dancing. The people of the Empire came quickly, faster than he thought. After the four-cylinder floating spaceship crashed, the follow-up military aircraft in charge of escorting it did not land to rescue their colleagues. Instead, they directly began to search the lake, preventing him from escaping at the first moment. Then more soldiers of the Empire came. He watched in silence for a moment, then lowered his head and continued his work. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 4 minutes. In the depths of the lake, where there was no oxygen, he had forgotten to breathe. Faint wisps of blood seeped out of the wounds on his face and nostrils, rising slowly like red smoke. The scorching energy inside his body roamed freely like the bloody mist. It entered every cell of his body, nourished his lungs, refreshed his mind, and ensured his survival. A red light suddenly flashed on the electrical control strap on the wound on his left shoulder. Under normal circumstances, when the light of this color flashed, the plastic explosives locked in the alloy balls would directly blow his upper body into pieces. His injured and swollen eyelids had turned white from being soaked in the lake water. Sulu closed his mouth tightly and continued to operate with his head lowered. He did not even blink. In fact, from the moment the spaceship crashed into the lake, the electronically controlled bombs on his shoulders had flashed red many times. Miraculously, there was no explosion. His mutilated and ugly corpse did not float up from the tranquil lake surrounded by the towering triangular maple forest, nor did a fish flip up its belly. The lake water in the depths of the lake slowly brushed against his black hair, like a clump of vigorous aquatic plants. He narrowed his eyes, silently and steadily disarming the bombs. From the moment he formulated this escape plan, the first thing he had to ensure was that the 2 bombs on his shoulders would not explode, and he had done it. Many days ago, lying in the intensive care ward of the Empire's Second Royal Hospital, his right index finger moved slightly under the clean white sheets. More than 10 days ago, the young nurse in charge of taking care of him lost a mobile phone. The corner of the bed was missing an inconspicuous metal screw and 2 even more inconspicuous steel wires. During those days and nights, he was like a real paralyzed patient, staring blankly at the snow-white ceiling above his head, the clean white sheets covering his thin body. None of the citizens of the Imperium could have imagined that, under the white bedsheet, his body could already move, but he did not. Instead, he turned the metal screws, wires, and mobile phones that had been dismantled into countless parts into slow-moving tools with his 5 fingers that were as nimble as a mechanic's genius. Disarming the sensitive electronically controlled bombs required very professional equipment. Even if the electronically controlled bombs could not receive signals, extremely precise tools were also required. However, for this Federation mechanic named Sulu, a phone, a metal screw, and a few steel wires were enough. There was still no sound from the depths of the lake. Sulu lowered his head to look at the electronically controlled bombs that were slowly peeling off from his shoulders. However, an extremely clear and pleasant click sounded in his heart. A hint of joy and relaxation flashed through his swollen eyes. After he was captured on the Red Rose, the electronically controlled bombs were bloodily tied to his shoulders. Even when he fought side by side with Huai Chaosher in the Mulberry Sea, that Highness had never intended to remove them for him, because the Empire could not underestimate his ability. Once the burden of a serious threat to his life was removed, the mental pressure also disappeared. Su Lu suddenly felt that his body was a lot lighter. He could not help but grin. However, his cheeks were full of red and swollen scars, and his white teeth had an unhealthy blood-red color. This smile could not help but be a bit strange. Still smiling happily, he reached out his hand and waved in the lake. He summoned a handful of lake water and splashed it on his face symbolically. He lightly stepped on the giant rock at the bottom of the lake, swayed his waist, and quietly swam to the surface of the lake like a big fish. He did not know how long he had held his breath at the bottom of the lake. Right now, he seemed to be able to survive without breathing for a short period of time. What was the difference between him and a fish? There was a bright light flashing on the surface of the lake. There was a faint vibration that went deep into the lake. The water waves refracted and reflected the light, turning into a strange mirror. He swam to this mirror. The spaceship crashed. The fugitive was a fugitive. Her Highness was furious. The Empire's troops around the capital of Tianjin planet moved at the fastest speed possible. In an extremely short period of time, thousands of soldiers firmly surrounded the lake. The high-powered searchlights were all turned on, illuminating the dark forest and lake as if it was daytime. Dozens of the Empire's latest model Wolf Fong mecha walked with heavy mechanical steps, closely patrolling the wetland by the lake. From time to time, huge maple trees would be knocked down, causing red leaves to fall all over the sky and startling countless night birds. On the surface of the lake, there were more than a dozen helicopters circling around. The strong wind of the spiral arms caused the lake water to splatter in all directions, as if a monster was about to drill out. Huai Chaoshe was personally on her way here. No matter how one looked at it, the Empire would definitely not allow Su Lu to truly escape. Moreover, he now knew even more secrets because of that ruthless and boring gambling game with Huai Chaoshe. Moreover, in the eyes of the Empire's emperor, his past was enough reason for him to die 800 times. On the western shore of the lake, in the low-lying water plants near the shadow of the forest, Su Lu slowly poked out half of his head. The lake water and sand silently slid down his face. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the bright white lake surface. Looking at the light beams in the forest around the lake, he could not suppress his shock. The Empire's people really thought too highly of him. They actually set up such a large formation. Mournful dog barks came from several hundred meters away. Even closer to him was a military vehicle with an instrument's wave-receiving screen facing the lake water and slowly scanning. Su Li's pupils constricted. Without hesitation, he lowered his head and once again dove into the depths of the lake. The other party had actually mobilized military dogs and life detectors at the same time in such a short amount of time. Other than diving into the depths of the lake, there was nothing else he could do. Once he entered the depths of the lake, he was a fish that happily swam around. He was confident that the Empire's people would definitely not be able to find him. However, just as he began to dive, before he had time to happily swim, the movement on the lake surface and the waves stirred up by the fierce wind attracted his attention. Looking at that enormous floating transport aircraft and the submarine hanging below it, Su Lu was tongue-tied. He was stunned speechless. Even a submarine was transported over. Huai Chaoshe, you really are ruthless. Su Lu silently praised in his heart. His body turned, and his legs quickly bounced as he swam toward the dark and safe depths of the lake. In the instant he emerged from the surface of the lake, Su Lu saw many details. He saw the other party's valiant determination, saw the north and south he wanted to see, and saw the things he didn't want to see. Continuing to hide at the bottom of the lake wasn't a solution. Based on the Empire's people's crazy search, even if their target was a small river crab in a boulder at the bottom of the lake, it would still be easily dug out. He had to leave this lake as quickly as possible. The north side of the lake passed through a green park and was connected to planet Tianjin's capital city. In that heavily guarded capital city, every street, every apartment, and even every toilet had microchip monitoring devices specially designed to deal with Federation spies. The Federation's people entering that area was purely courting death. The south side of the lake was a lush red maple forest. This maple forest was artificially planted in the beginning. Under the deliberate protection of the empire's royal family, under the long years of protection, it gradually became the rarest primeval forest on this planet. There were large trees and leaves that were large enough to cover one's body, and the difficult terrain that was most advantageous for escaping. Most importantly, there weren't many microchip monitoring devices in the primeval forest. The north side was dangerous. It was like a giant beast that had been silent for thousands of years. It was an ancient tomb full of traps, ready to swallow anyone who entered by mistake at any time. It wouldn't even spit out their bones. The south side was enticement. It was like a piece of white paper that anyone could paint on. A naked virgin attracted people to bravely move forward, using their own adventurous footprints to paint a beautiful picture. No matter from which perspective one looked at it from, Su should choose to escape to the south. This had nothing to do with the inertia of his thinking. The objective environment of planet Tianjing determined that this was his only choice. The problem is that the Empire's people think this way, and so does Huai Chaosher. Su narrowed his eyes as he waved the ice-cold lake water. He silently swam towards the shore in the north. After an unknown amount of time, he unsurprisingly found the exit of the underground waterway at the bottom of the lake. A sincere smile once again appeared on his miserable face. Chapter 6:14. Where there was a city, there would be a lot of people. Where there were a lot of people, there would be a lot of garbage and wastewater. Regardless of whether it was treated or not, the filthy liquid mixed with vegetable leaves, watermelon peels, and feces had to be discharged. Due to the importance of sewers to human life, many historians had always insisted that a perfect underground drainage system was one of the most important inventions in human history. The quality of a city's drainage system directly reflected the level of the city's social civilization. As the largest city in the left sky starfield, Tianjing planet's capital city undoubtedly had the most developed drainage system in the empire. Thousands of square kilometers of the city's concrete underground, complex sewer pipes extended like a spider web. Some of the sewers could only allow hungry rats to crawl through, while most of the main sewers were built to be incomparably huge, so much so that it felt like they could accommodate battleships in space. Su crawled for a long distance in the pitch-black sewers, then walked silently for a while. Looking at the huge sewer system in front of him, he couldn't help but shake his head. The cheerful song of optimism in his heart also temporarily stopped. He was like a fish swimming freely in the water. After climbing out of Maple Lake, fatigue and pain quickly invaded his body along with the dry air. The large amount of blood loss caused by the cruel whip made his body extremely weak. What was even more frightening was that at the moment when the spaceship fell into the lake, his left leg that was supporting the front desk of the cockpit had suffered too much force. Even though the magical burning power in his body had been completely unleashed, his leg and knee were still severely injured. There were signs of fractures. Another problem was that he didn't know where to go. In the 3-story underground space in front of him, there were more than 10 holes. Some of the holes were pitch black, while some of the holes were faintly lit. No one knew which sewer would lead to which part of the city, or would it circle back to the heavily surrounded lake. The drainage system of Tianjing planet's capital city was first designed thousands of years ago. Countless generations of administrators had continuously modified it, and half of the city's underground space had been hollowed out. The cobweb-like pipes were terrifyingly complex. Even if the engineers of the Empire's city management department came here with all the historical drawings, it was very likely that they would be trapped in a maze, unable to leave, and could only starve to death. Not to mention a foreigner like him who didn't have any maps. He looked around at a loss. The 5th cup of wine, the youth is about to fly, passing through the layers of forests. This young master is drinking so beautifully. After pondering in silence for a long time, he took out a water bag made of leaves and grass from the edge of his underwear and greedily drank the 5th mouthful of water. Then, he grinned and took a deep breath, as if he had drunk a mouthful of extremely strong wine. He took a few quick breaths to calm down the suffocating feeling in his chest and abdomen. His thin gray lips opened and closed silently, and he began to sing the familiar sad melody again. The peaceful smile on his face was still there, and he actually sang a lot of happy feelings. The cold underground buildings around him and the imperial food bags in the sewage all carried the smell of hostility. In this lake, this forest, this city, this planet, and this universe, he could not get any help. He could only fight alone, a lonely and dangerous battle. He never knew where he would step next. If he did not have the heart to turn water into wine and sing sad songs into war songs, he would always fall into despair. But he was Sulu, so he did not despair. After a short rest, he exhaled a mouthful of turbid air and moved his legs with difficulty, walking toward the complicated underground sewer in front of him. Since he did not know where to go, he just randomly picked a passage. Because a fugitive always had to go forward, and walking was the foundation of all behavior, and no one in the Empire thought that he dared to escape to the city through the underground sewer, and Huai Chaoshu did not think that either. So most of the troops chasing him were basically concentrated on the south side of Feng Lake. He quietly walked in the underground sewer for a long time, but he did not meet a single soldier of the Empire. Until now. Like a wild cat wandering in the night, he quietly climbed up the rusty stairs to the platform in the sewer that was as high as 2 people and then stopped. In the dim light on the ground in front of him, there were a few dark figures. He could clearly see that these people were holding guns in their hands, and he could clearly hear them talking in a low voice in the Empire language with a dialect. The Empire's troops mainly focused on the forest on the south side of the lake, but they still sent people to control a few transit passages in the underground sewer. Obviously, both Her Majesty and Huai Chaoshu felt endless anger toward his successful escape and did not want to leave any gap for him to fly out. It was very strange that the air in the underground sewer was very dry with the sound of water splashing. Sulu stood in the corner and silently listened to the subtle sounds in front of him. He pursed his dry lips and slowly took off the leaf bag tied to his underwear. He squatted down and put it by his feet without making any sound. After falling into the lake, except for the very comfortable cotton underwear, Sulu did not have a single piece of clothing on his body. The clear lines of muscles on his naked and thin body quietly hid under his skin. As he squatted, the lines slowly appeared, as if they were accumulating strength. A dry wind blew in the dark sewer. Sulu was like a hunting cheetah. Along with the wind, he was faster than the wind. He quietly bounced up and pounced toward the front left. His bare right foot continuously stepped on the dry ground. Bush, bush, bush. His body seemed to have turned into a light smoke as he quickly killed his way to the front of the 3 dumbfounded Empire soldiers. These Empire soldiers who were responsible for guarding the entrance to sewer number 45 thought that it was just a very ordinary duty. They did not expect that the fugitive from the Federation would be so bold as to choose to sneak into the underground sewer. They also did not expect that the fugitive would dare to attack them with his bare hands. One of the Empire soldiers reacted extremely quickly. He raised his gun and aimed at the figure, preparing to pull the trigger. However, in the next moment, he discovered in despair that his right index finger could not pull the trigger at all. This was because Su Li's hand had already arrived first. With a crisp crack, Su Li's right hand bizarrely bounced out from under his left elbow with a whoosh. It ruthlessly smashed into the elbow of the Empire soldier who was holding the gun. The ruthless blow was directed against the joint, instantly shattering this person's elbow. Almost at the same time, his left hand quickly bounced out and pierced this person's throat like a bolt of lightning. Then his left hand bounced back at an even faster speed. He did not even look at this Empire soldier who was helplessly clutching his throat. His 5 fingers spread out, and with his shoulder as the axis, he violently slapped down at another Empire soldier with incomparable ferocity. The second Empire soldier did not have time to shoot. He only had time to subconsciously block in front of him with his gun, blocking that incomparably violent palm. The palm wind howled fiercely. Su Li's eyes narrowed slightly. His face was expressionless as he unreasonably slapped down. Together with that ice-cold gun, he slapped down on the second Empire soldier's face. A terrifying muffled sound rang out. The face of the Imperial soldier was like soft cream, with a bloody gunshot mark and a palm print added to it. He didn't even make a sound before he fell stiffly to the ground. There was still one last Empire soldier. Su Li's right leg kicked forward, his right elbow raised diagonally, and struck viciously toward that person's eyebrows. This was the most commonly used move among the 10 powerful melee techniques that were deeply ingrained in his bones. However, to his surprise, this elbow was actually blocked by that Empire soldier. Su Li's eyes suddenly lit up. Without hesitation, his right leg went forward again, his left hand pulled back, and his fingertips went straight for the other party's throat. He flicked his finger, twisted his wrist, swung his elbow, and pushed his knee. The other party moved his finger, twisted his wrist, chopped his elbow, and kicked his leg. Bam 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 bam. A series of dense sounds of flesh colliding rang out in the quiet underground sewer, producing strange echoes. In the gloomy underground sewer, it was almost impossible to see the two fiercely fighting figures clearly. The two parties in the battle had no time to think, no time to make a judgment. They could only rely on their battle instincts that had been honed for countless years to carry out absolute melee combat. At this moment, Su Li vividly displayed the 10 stances that he had learned since he was a teenager. His eyes grew brighter and brighter, but he could not see that Empire soldier's face clearly. He only knew that the other party could not make any sound for help under his suppression. Two pairs of tough hands finally clashed together like two weapons from the cold weapon era, unable to be separated like cast iron. Every finger of both parties tightly clawed at the other party's wrist, blood spurting out. Without any warning, Su Li's injured left leg that had been dragging behind suddenly bounced up and violently struck the Empire soldier's ribs. With a muffled grunt, Su Li did not give the other party any chance to counterattack. Using the force of this kick, he bounced up. His hands were still firmly holding onto the other party's wrist. His right knee kicked out again, right in the middle of that person's chest. That extremely powerful Empire soldier finally could not resist this sharp chain of attacks. He spat out a mouthful of blood and fell into the dirty water below, creating a splash. He either fainted or died with the waves. The heavily injured left leg landed on the ground with a sharp pain. Su Li's face suddenly paled. He staggered back a few steps, but he tightly pursed his lips and did not make any sound. After a few hurried breaths, he looked with a trace of lingering fear at the sewer below that had already calmed down. He then looked at his bleeding wrist. How could there be such a strong person among ordinary Empire soldiers? The details of the dangerous battle quickly flashed in his mind. Su Li's expression suddenly became a little strange. He always felt that there was a very strange atmosphere before, but the real reason for this atmosphere could not be grasped. He only remembered that when both parties were holding hands, his fingertips seemed to have touched an extremely hard thing. Was it a watch or a bracelet? He lowered his head and looked at his left wrist. The ordinary-looking metal bracelet was now covered in blood and looked extremely hideous. Subconsciously, a trace of expectation and doubt appeared on his face. His fingertips gently rubbed the edge of the bracelet. Chapter 6:15. Su Li's breathing became heavy, not because of his injuries, but because of the faint light emitted by the bracelet on his wrist. The surface of the bracelet flowed like mercury, and light suddenly shot out from within, condensing in the air not far in front of him. The starry dots converged into lines, and the lines converged into a structure. The structure glowed with a beautiful starry sky, and it clearly displayed a map. The several rough passages on the complicated map accurately matched the complex underground waterway in front of him. The map of the Federation's major secret prisons was hidden in the bracelet left by the uncle. This was confirmed a long time ago, and there were also some drawings in the bracelet that he didn't know where they were from. Only now did he confirm them. It was actually a top-secret map of the Empire's capital city of Tianjin. Feng, you must have been to the Empire before. From the Emperor's anger and the story told by Huai Chaoshi, this could be confirmed. However, the fact that such a treasure was hidden in the bracelet was still beyond Su Li's imagination. Since he had already encountered the enemy, the Empire should soon discover his whereabouts. Although he was shocked, he didn't have time to digest this emotion. Using his superhuman mental control, he calmed his rapid breathing, raised his black eyebrows slightly, and stripped off the Empire's military uniform and boots as quickly as possible. At the same time, he picked up the gun and the Empire's internal communication system. At this moment, he didn't need to force himself to be optimistic and sing the sad song of 27 glasses of wine in a half-crazy state. Wearing the ill-fitting military boots, he looked at the three-dimensional map in the air in front of him and walked in the direction indicated by the map without thinking. He gasped in his heart and made hissing sounds. The dark underground waterway instantly swallowed his figure, and only the faint light on his wrist flickered like a firefly, but it was exceptionally quiet. Breathing heavily, he opened the bracelet with his fingers. There were maps of the Federation's major prisons inside, and there were also maps that he didn't know what they were. Looking at the whole, he put them together and walked in. He was so shocked that he stopped singing. Wearing the ill-fitting shoes, he gasped all the way and walked into the dark tunnel. Hiss, 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 hiss. A convoy of armored vehicles and bulletproof heavy vehicles sped along the empty streets of the capital city. Due to the sudden incident, the entire city entered a state of emergency. The order of curfew was issued to every family. The nervous military police spread out like hunters at every corner of the city. No civilians dared to walk on the streets. All the streets and alleys were dead silent. This group of carriages tore through the thick darkness of the night and headed south. In this kind of night, the streets were like ghosts, causing people to feel fear in their hearts. Your Highness, orbital conversion number 7 is already in place. As long as the search team comes into contact with the target, we can immediately pinpoint its exact location. Jesse, the head of the Imperial Military Tactical Warfare Bureau, frowned as he spoke to his subordinates in a low voice. He raised his head to look at the young officer in the back and said in a deep voice, "The dense formation is ready to launch. As long as the precise positioning is successful, a dense bombardment will definitely destroy the target." Huai Chaoshi calmly moved her eyes away from the light screen in front of her. She glanced at the hardline subordinate who came from the military and coldly shook her head, rejecting this proposal. For some reason, she, who was angered by Su Li's bizarre escape, didn't choose to take the faster fighter to the Maple Lake area. Instead, she chose to go south by car. Your Highness, I admit that the political situation is indeed not stable right now. The remnants of the rebellion of the nobles haven't been dealt with yet. At this time, it is indeed difficult to explain a big explosion in the suburbs of the capital city. Director Jesse tried to persuade her, but this person from the Federation is the murderer of County King Carlton and Prince Doring. His Majesty is very angry. Those nobles of the Senate who went to see him in the hospital, he looked at Huai Chaoshi hesitantly and said in a low voice, "A lot of people know that he was captured by you, but they also know the things that happened on Libenstar. If we can't get rid of him as soon as possible, I'm afraid there will be some unfavorable rumors about you." Huai Chaoshi looked at him and narrowed her eyes. Director Jesse suddenly felt that the temperature in the car dropped a lot. It was a bit cold and piercing to the bone. He hesitantly closed his mouth. "I know better than anyone how dangerous this person from the Federation is. His death is also very important to stabilize the mood of the nobles. If it is necessary, I am even willing to throw all the high-energy bombs stored by the military into Maple Lake and blow up that big lake into a scorched pit." Huai Chaoshi looked at her most loyal subordinate indifferently. She didn't get angry. She slowly said, "But I don't think that the troops by the lake can accurately pinpoint his location in such a short time." Director Jesse frowned. Although he was incomparably respectful of Her Highness in front of him, Her Highness' words were equivalent to not trusting the ability of the Empire's soldiers. He faintly expressed admiration for that fugitive from the Federation. He couldn't help but say, "That's impossible. Although the terrain of the South Coast Forest is complicated, I have already sent over 10,000 troops and several dozen Wolf-Fang machines. Even if they can't kill him, finding him shouldn't be a problem." Huai Chaoshi raised her head and looked at the night sky outside the car window. She didn't answer her subordinate's question and asked, "Has there ever been a Federation person in history that could survive for an hour on Tianjin planet?" Director Jesse's answer was very resolute and decisive. So don't be too nervous. Once a person is chained, no matter how strong they can only become a dog tied to a wooden stake. No matter how much they struggle, they can't run too far. Wai Caoshir's gaze returned to the screen of light. She examined the situation map sent back from the surroundings of Maple Lake. A trace of a smile appeared at the corner of her mouth. There was a trace of coldness in that smile. She silently thought of that fellow who was currently running for his life. I'll let you bloom once more in the last moments of your life. The interior of the car once again sank into a deathly silence. After a long time, there was still silence. The search and capture team in front of Maple Lake still hadn't reported back with the latest situation. After Director Jesse contacted his subordinates again, his expression became even more unsightly. He hesitantly glanced at Her Highness, who seemed to be resting with her eyes closed, and said in a low voice, "We still haven't found the target. The majority of the South Bank's troops have been combed through. They haven't encountered any attacks. The detectors and submarines also haven't detected any abnormalities in the lake." Wai Caoshir raised her head and narrowed her eyes. After a long period of silence, she suddenly opened her mouth and asked, "What's the situation in the north? Are there any movements in the underground tunnels?" Jesse was slightly startled. He thought to himself that although the plan had set up 3 interception lines in the North Bank, how could that fugitive from the Federation be so stupid as to walk into the city? According to your instructions, the microchip monitoring system in the underground tunnels has been completely activated at the first moment. It's just that there may be some small problems due to the equipment in a few nodes not being maintained for a long time. However, it won't affect the overall situation. Wai Caoshir didn't say anything. She only narrowed her eyes even more, and her neat eyelashes flashed like sharp knives. Immediately after, bad news came. The troops in charge of searching for anyone in the underground tunnels were confirmed to have been attacked 3 times, and no one survived. Your Highness, I specifically moved Chi Dabin to the underground tunnels. In the end, even he was knocked down. Right now, we don't know if he's still alive. Jesse wiped the cold sweat from his forehead. He didn't have time to express his shock. He quickly explained that he didn't underestimate Her Highness' initial order. Wai Caoshir frowned. She knew that Chi Dabin was a powerful soldier from the Royal Special Forces. She didn't expect that even that person couldn't stop Sulu. How can you move when you're supposed to be paralyzed? You've lost so much blood and suffered such heavy injuries. How can you still run so far away? You followed the underground tunnels to the capital. Don't you know that I can grab the leash behind your neck at any time? Looking at the night sky outside the window, Wai Caoshir expressionlessly talked to the fugitive. Completely seal off the exit of the underground tunnels. Yes. Chief Jesse replied in a deep voice. Although he knew that it was impossible to completely seal off the complex and terrifying underground sewer system of the Tianjin planet, when he thought of the microchip on the back of the fugitive's neck and the monitoring devices all over the city, his confidence returned to him. The window rolled down, and the night wind blew in. There was a long period of silence, and there was no feedback. His confidence gradually collapsed. Jesse's face was filled with disbelief and nervousness. Wai Caoshir narrowed her eyes and looked at the trees on the street that were swaying uneasily in the night wind. For the first time, she felt uneasy. Has there ever been a person from the Federation who could survive on Tianjin for an hour? She thought of the cold question she had asked earlier, and a bad omen suddenly appeared in her heart. Now, an hour had passed, and there was still no sign of Sulu. Only then did she remember that she had forgotten something. Many years ago, that person from the Federation called Nasri had lived on Tianjin planet for a very long time and had even lived there for a very long time. A burst of gunfire that was not beautiful was spat out. The muffled gunshot reverberated in the spacious and quiet underground tunnels for a long time before it slowly disappeared. In a dark corner, Sulu held the standard gun of the Empire's military. He stared at the platform in the distance with a determined expression. After observing for a long time and confirming that the 6 soldiers from the Empire had all been killed by him, he started walking forward again. This was the 3rd batch of soldiers from the Empire that he had encountered during his escape in the underground tunnels. In a sudden exchange of gunfire, he used his eyesight that was much sharper than the average person's and the marksmanship that Bai Yulan had practiced to quickly eliminate the enemies. Old thing, even without your eyes, my marksmanship is still awesome. He dragged his injured leg and limped forward with difficulty. There was no expression on his tired face, but he was constantly cheering himself on in his heart. He had been on the run for more than an hour. He knew that even if the Empire had not discovered him yet, he would be exposed soon. More importantly, the closer he got to Tianjin along the underground tunnels, the more likely it was that he would encounter a chip monitoring device. It was time to take out the chip behind his neck. But he kept hesitating. Chapter 616. The sofa in the condominium in Wangdu was not too short. Su Le liked to nestle on it and watch Channel 23 with snacks in his arms. This showed that his life was actually as warm and harmonious as many ordinary young people. However, many things that happened in the past few years were enough to prove that once he was forced into a corner by his environment or his own obsession, he would always squint his eyes and smash his way through with a straight face. He acted out the words decisive and ruthless in an exceptionally vivid manner. Removing the chip from the back of his neck and avoiding the surveillance of the Empire, he quietly entered the vast sea of people in the capital city. Using the prosperity of the common world to hide his tracks, he patiently waited for the Empire to reveal any gaps. He would find all possible ways to leave this planet, infiltrate the border star system, prepare to face the counterattack of the Federal forces, or directly pass through the passage of the Night Scorpion Nebula and return to his hometown. This was his initial escape plan. Once the plan was set, with his personality, he would resolutely carry it out without any hesitation. Therefore, today's hesitation was not because of the confusion of his identity as an artsy youth or because his spirit was bleak after being severed from the past. It was because of a very simple reason. He was afraid of pain. To be more precise, he was afraid of fainting from the pain and becoming a pitiful unconscious prey under the iron hooves of the Empire's search and capture forces. In the autumn of the 65th year of the constitutional era, he began the first escape of his life, an escape that changed the trajectory of his life. At the beginning of that escape, he replaced the chip on the back of his neck. As a result, he was unconscious for an entire night in the green hills and autumn forests during the storm. Now, 5 years had passed in the blink of an eye, and he began to escape again. However, the pain that humans could not endure and could only passively resist by fainting was still fresh in his mind. He did not dare to forget it, and there was still lingering fear in his heart. If it was when he was in the Federation, he still dared to look for a secluded place to gamble. Now, countless Imperial soldiers were searching for him. Once he fainted from the pain, he would fall into the sea of death forever. Moving forward with difficulty in the underground sewers, with the help of the sewers map in his bracelet, he originally wanted to find a safe place to replace the chip on the back of his neck. However, he did not expect the Imperial armies to be so aggressive in their pursuit. There was no good opportunity at all. In the underground sewer that was as dark as the passage of time, he carried his gun and stepped on his military boots that were constantly wearing out. He looked at the map and moved forward in silence. However, the question kept echoing in his mind: to gamble or not to gamble? It took him a total of 3 minutes to come up with the answer. 300 meters away, in a dark corner without any light, Su Le took a deep breath as he looked at the iron gate of the outer passage in the distance. A fierce look flashed across his swollen and squinted eyes as his left hand, which was hanging by his waist, suddenly tightened. The metal wire in the bracelet slowly extended like a ghost and aimed at the bare skin behind his neck. The surroundings were pitch black, but the metal wire reflected the light from somewhere. The extremely thin and sharp metal wire swayed gently in his slightly trembling hand, as if it would snap with a crisp sound if it swayed a little more. Su Le took another deep breath and then closed his eyes. His left hand moved closer to the back of his neck again. When the metal wire was 3 centimeters away from the back of his neck, the sharp tip of the wire suddenly trembled strangely. It was like a hungry bee that suddenly smelled the scent of enchanting nectar. It quickly flapped its transparent wings excitedly. Tiny and invisible electric charges continuously condensed at the tip of the metal wire, and an extremely small electromagnetic field enveloped the area behind his neck. A small bump slowly appeared on his bare skin. Su Li's face was expressionless, and his eyes were tightly closed. He could feel the strange feeling behind his neck, but he did not have any reaction. Although the last time he replaced the chip was 5 years ago, he remembered every detail very clearly. The sewage under the underground platform slowly flowed, and the dry air was full of the smell of decay. Suddenly, the tip of the metal wire extended automatically and accurately pierced the bump on the back of his neck. Then it kept vibrating and probing into the cervical vertebrae. The intense pain went along the nerve bundles in the cervical vertebrae and fiercely blasted into the brain. Su Li's half-kneeling body suddenly stiffened. His tightly closed eyes suddenly opened, and his face twisted in pain. The burning heat and the endless pain in his body intertwined, and it seemed that he was about to burn into ashes. A few minutes later, a trembling figure stretched out his right hand with difficulty and touched the heavy iron door. He walked out of the underground sewer and climbed up the old-style stairs to the surface. When he climbed out of the ground, he half-crouched in a bush to rest for a while. Then the figure painfully struggled to stand up again and continued to move forward. He looked like a dying, seriously ill patient who could fall to the ground and die at any time. Fortunately, he did not faint from the pain. Unfortunately, he needed to be awake to endure the increasingly intense pain. The joints where the chip was implanted in his cervical vertebrae were so painful that they were about to shatter, and his fingers were starting to feel numb. The night was dark, and there was not a single person on the streets in the southwest of Tianjin. Su Lu, with a pale face, followed the green field by the street, moving his body that was constantly trembling because of the pain. His trembling body brushed against the bush, making a rustling sound. Fortunately, the night wind was strong, and the branches of the trees brushed against each other from time to time, covering the sound that could possibly expose his whereabouts. Because he did not faint, he could clearly feel the strange feeling and unbearable pain behind his neck more clearly than 5 years ago. He dragged his injured legs slowly in the grass, and his weak body that was about to be unable to support him anymore. He did not even notice that his teeth had bitten through his lips, and the small amount of blood that was originally not much dripped onto his military uniform. A person who was extremely sleepy would not be able to see the bed, a person who was extremely hungry would not be able to see the food, and a person who was in extreme pain would not be able to relax in the slightest. At this moment, Su Li's heart was filled with endless temptation. He wanted to collapse right here and now, so that he would never wake up again. He was not willing to endure this terrifying pain and torture. Other than the pain, there was also a strange feeling of emptiness. This time, he was not replacing the chip, but executing the program to remove it. Since he was born more than 20 years ago, this was the first time that there was no chip at the back of his neck. Although the people of the Federation could not feel the existence of the chip, their rationality told them that the chip was not there. That feeling was like one of their organs had suddenly disappeared, and it was inexplicable. The pain and emptiness of the frustration, the unknown danger ahead, and the desire to faint constantly assaulted him. Su Lu tightly pursed his lips, resisting with superhuman willpower. Perhaps it was because in the hospital, during the days when his entire body was paralyzed and he forcefully broke through his meridians, he had already endured too many levels of pain that were rarely seen in the world, so he managed to hold on, even though it was very difficult. Fortunately, the pain and suffering were worth it. After leaving the underground sewer system and entering the heavily guarded surface of the city, he did not alarm the ubiquitous monitoring devices of the Empire's chip. However, the dangers still existed. After struggling for a long time in the gaps between the residential apartment buildings, a straight and empty road blocked his way. What was even more troublesome was that there were many military police at the entrance of the road, vigilantly watching the surrounding movements. The target of his plan was the chaotic slum area that lacked effective supervision a few kilometers away. If he had no choice but to stay in this residential area, it would be very difficult for him to avoid the military police's search during the day. The road in front of him was not very wide. If he was in his usual healthy state, he would only need to bend his body and take a few steps to pass by without alarming the military police at all. However, the problem was that he was in his weakest state right now and could collapse at any time. The dim street lights, through the bushes, fell on his pale cheeks. He narrowed his eyes and looked in that direction, waiting for the right time. However, he found that because of the pain and exhaustion, his vision began to blur. He could not hold on any longer. At this moment, a seemingly drunk Empire man staggered across the sidewalk at the edge of the bushes, mumbling something in his mouth, and rushed to the other side of the street. Probably only the extremely drunk Empire people could ignore the gloomy faces of the military police, and they did not know that there was a curfew tonight. The military police at the entrance of the road became nervous. They shouted and surrounded the drunk man. The military police who did not move also subconsciously looked in that direction. Sulu did not let go of this fleeting opportunity. He struggled to take a deep breath of the slightly cold autumn night wind of the Empire. His throat that seemed to be smoking slightly moistened. His right leg that had already sunk deep into the mud suddenly exerted strength, and the military pants on his leg were torn apart. The last burst of strength caused his body to turn into a gray shadow and instantly swept across the street. He fell heavily into the mud. He did not dare to make the slightest sound. He continued to lie there for a long time, resisting the strong desire to faint from his brain. After confirming that the military police did not discover him, he carefully raised his body with his hands on the ground and looked back at the entrance of the road. The drunk man who could be regarded as his savior had been brutally beaten to the ground by the military police with a taser. He was rolling on the ground in pain. Sulu narrowed his eyes and was silent for a moment. Then he turned his head back. He struggled to walk through the alley with wet flagstones. He held onto the wall to pass through the small paths between the buildings. He painfully used his hands and feet to climb over the low walls. In this strange and foreign city, he slowly but firmly moved forward. His body was getting colder and colder, and his trembling was getting worse and worse. He felt like his left leg was broken, and he could not feel anything. His vision was getting blurrier and blurrier. The night was still so dark, and the main street of the city was still so dangerous. After rolling and crawling into the messy and dirty street, he still did not dare to relax his vigilance. His back was against a short wall mottled with gray stains, and his chest was violently moving up and down. There was a roof on the wall, and dew gently dripped down from the roof onto his face. He subconsciously raised his head and took a sip. The tip of his tongue slid across his dry lips. His spirit was slightly better. Sulu observed the messy environment around him. He followed the corner of the wall into a dilapidated small courtyard, and then used the last of his strength to climb up the dusty attic. Opposite the attic, there was a stray cat. It was curled up in the green grass that grew out of the corner of the roof. It curiously opened its eyes and looked at this strange guy. Chapter 617. Are you going? Of course, I'm going. I heard that the best trees in the plaza were all taken by the students from the West City. If we are late, I'm afraid we won't be able to see anything. I don't want to go, but there definitely won't be any business in the market. So, look at the officials at the management office. I shouldn't have said that. Let's go. Our empire hasn't had such a big event for many years. Who said that? I participated in the celebration ceremony after the big explosion 20 years ago. That scene, don't say so much. Everyone, let's go together. Let's go together. Let's go together. Let's go together. Listening to the excited conversations of the nearby people, a trace of disgust and helplessness flashed across Aunt Susan's chubby face. Looking at the people rushing out of the market like fish that had eaten drugs, she could not help but curse in a low voice in annoyance. Wiping the dust stains on her hands on her apron, she walked to the management office and took a small flag that was distributed to her. Stepping on the mud and cigarette butts, she joined the crowd. Today, the city's underground transportation system was all open for free. People from all over the city were continuously sent to the empty square of the Arc de Triomphe. It didn't take long for the people from the slums in the northwest to enter the sea of people that was faintly moving. Susan looked at the small flag in her hand. She felt that the black hibiscus flower on the flag was a little dazzling. The hand that was holding the flag was sweaty and uncomfortable. She was like a puppet, waving the flag mechanically along with the excited people around her. However, she kept cursing in her heart. Today was the 723rd year of the empire's Hibiscus dynasty. The nobles' rebellion that caused a commotion a few days ago had been completely quelled. According to the imperial edict, a small number of ambitious nobles took advantage of the fact that the enemy of the Federation was closing in to launch a barbaric rebellion against the glorious imperial family. In this rebellion, the respected military minister of the empire, Prince Bai Wu, heroically sacrificed himself. Li Banstar's governor, Kabouning, bravely sacrificed himself for the country. Now that the rebellion had been quelled, it was time to punish the evil of those ambitious nobles. His Majesty, the Great Emperor, summoned the citizens of Tianjin Planet from all walks of life to the Triumphal Arch Plaza to witness this righteous trial. After a long period of silence and anxious anticipation, it was finally time for the gallows to be erected. Looking at the primitive black gallows being lifted up by cranes and the noble criminals with black cloth covering their heads being escorted out by the soldiers, the sea of people suddenly let out the first wave of cheers. With the center of the square as the center, a wave formed by heads rose one after another and spread out. A pale-faced and haggard noble was escorted to the gallows. After taking off his black mask, he was not used to the light in the gloomy day. He narrowed his eyes and looked around in fear, but he was even more frightened by the countless excited faces of the civilians around the gallows. He wanted to say something, but no words came out. The empire's chief judge passionately read the verdict, and then without any pause, the crisp metal door opened. The noble fell straight into the circular hole, and the black noose around his neck was pulled taut. Since the start of the execution, the crowd of spectators in the square had maintained absolute silence. It had been many years since they had seen such a vivid and bloody execution scene. The crowd's expectations were high and did not fall. It was not until this scene that they seemed to have woken up. They seemed to have clearly heard the sound of the noose ruthlessly breaking the nobleman's vertebrae. They could not help but shout excitedly. Aunt Susan looked at the gallows in the distance with a complicated expression and couldn't help but close her eyes. The nobles were executed one after another. Their necks were broken by the black noose, and they stopped breathing. Every time the black noose was pulled taut, and every time the noble's body fell down heavily, it would cause the tens of thousands of people in the square to shout excitedly. Especially when the noblewomen were executed, the emotions of the people in the square were extremely excited. The sweaty male commoners, the poor, and the untouchables widened their eyes as they watched the noblewomen's jade-white calves kick in the air in vain, twitching until they became quiet, as if they were watching an exciting private performance in broad daylight. They couldn't help but sigh in satisfaction, but their faces immediately changed into a mask of shyness, timidity, and pity. Aunt Susan was pushed around by the excited crowd. Looking at the young ladies of the noble families who were hung, she tightened her grip on the black hibiscus flag. She pursed her lips tighter and tighter, and her thick eyebrows tighter and tighter. She let out a real sigh in her heart. The trial was over. Aunt Susan rubbed her slightly dizzy forehead and walked to the subway entrance listlessly. It was the imperial edict for the civilians to come to watch the trial, and the royal family flag that she was holding was an anti-distribution item of the Federation. She had to come. However, she didn't need to participate in the parade later, and she didn't want to. On the way back to the market by public transport, she saw tens of thousands of young men of the empire marching outside the car window. Those boys were waving flags, shouting slogans like "Long live His Majesty" and "Punish the traitors." They were fanatically walking through the streets and alleys of the city. Aunt Susan walked into the muddy streets and bought a lot of cheap vegetables from the market. After paying the principal and interest for this month's quota, she carried the vegetables back to her shabby courtyard and handed them to the pair of hands that reached out from the side room. At the same time, she took a batch of goods from the pair of hands that needed to be sold and put them on her three-wheeled electric scooter. After carefully checking the quantity of the goods, Aunt Susan found that something was wrong. She finally couldn't help but burst out in anger. She put her hands on her bucket-like waist and scolded the person next to her, "You are so clumsy. You can't even do a simple job like assembling a few broken machines. Do you think I feed you for free? I don't know how expensive you are." Aunt Susan suddenly thought of something and stopped scolding. She glanced at the entrance of the courtyard vigilantly, spat on the ground, and started the electric scooter to drive out of the courtyard. Today, Aunt Susan was a rude woman who lived in the slums of the capital. She relied on selling pirated video players and the empire's minimum wage to survive. Many years ago, she was also a delicate noble lady. She had a pair of jade-like legs like those noble ladies on the gallows in the square today. Her parents, who were middle-class nobles, were secretly executed because they were involved in a struggle between the 6 departments of the empire. She, who was lucky enough to survive, and she and her brother depended on each other in the only house left by the family. Later, her firm and gentle brother bravely joined the Imperial Expeditionary Force in order to restore the glory of the family. However, many years later, Susan welcomed the bad news that her brother violated military discipline and was executed. The last house of the family could no longer be preserved. Susan, who had a hard life, fell into the slums. She was extremely lucky to meet a husband who loved her and cared for her. However, after only 3 years of marriage, her husband fell ill and died, leaving only her and her son to depend on each other. The noble lady who would frown when she stepped on small pebbles in her gorgeous dancing shoes, under the merciless grinding of fate, became an auntie with a shrewish character, a bucket-like waist, and hard-soled imitation military boots. She could step on the muddy water in the market and make the sound of splashing water. The strong or obese body pressed on the small electric scooter looked funny, but for some reason, it was also sad. In the market, a fierce quarrel broke out again with the male competitors. Relying on her superior lung capacity and extremely filthy verbal attack, Aunt Susan won another victory. She successfully occupied the best mobile stall in the market, sold 2 pirated video and audio players, and then gave 60% of the profit to the market management office and the tattooed hooligans with both hands. She beamed with joy and offered 60% of the profit to the market management office and the tattooed hooligans with both hands. She wanted to live, and she wanted to live with her son. She needed to quarrel day after day, she needed to succeed day after day, and she needed to give her hard-earned money to those parasites with a smile every day. However, every time she returned to the dilapidated small courtyard late at night, the energy in her strong body would be completely consumed by these successful quarrels and smiles. Aunt Susan was extremely tired. In the dark alley, she leaned weakly against the courtyard door. Thinking of the argument with the old guy in the afternoon, thinking of the dirty words that she didn't dare to let her son hear, and thinking of the reservedness of her teenage years, she couldn't help but raise her calloused hands, covered her weathered cheeks, and slowly squatted down. Oh, what a life it was, for a hard life. Memories were a luxury that could only be found once in a while. Even sadness was a luxury, because it would make life more difficult. Aunt Susan stubbornly stood up straight, patted the dust on her big buttocks, murmured a few words in a low voice, and then turned around and walked into her small courtyard. Her life still had hope, and her well-behaved and sensible son, who was studying at the 2nd university in the capital. Her difficult life was no longer all gray and black because of that boy. According to her income, it was absolutely impossible for her to pay the expensive tuition fees of the 2nd university. Fortunately, His Majesty had promoted the Equal Education Program, which allowed excellent students like her son to have the right to study for free and equal. Because of this, Aunt Susan, who deeply hated the imperial family for half of her life, quickly forgave His Majesty. After parking the scooter, she climbed up the small attic with difficulty. She had become a rude but kind woman. With her arms akimbo and her index finger as thick as a branch, she angrily scolded the black-haired young man who was in a daze deep in the dark room. "How many have you assembled in the past 4 hours? How can there be such a stupid person like you?" The black-haired young man bitterly rubbed his face. Those faint scars were no longer clear. He looked at the sturdy woman at the door and helplessly explained in a low voice, "I told you yesterday that the goods your boss gave you were not right. There was a problem with the model of the spinner on the bayonet, and I couldn't screw it at all. I had to polish them one by one. Of course, it took a long time. Chapter 6:18. The dim light shone on the black-haired young man's face. After hearing this sentence, his ink-like straight eyebrows suddenly trembled, but he didn't say anything. When Aunt Susan saw his reaction, she thought that her words had touched his sad soul. She couldn't help but feel a little regretful and hesitantly shut her mouth. She casually made some small talk and walked downstairs, patting the back of her head regretfully. 10 days ago, Aunt Susan, who had gotten up early in the morning to prepare for a day's work, was shocked to find a black-haired young man covered in blood lying on the dusty floor of her house in a deep coma. He looked abnormally terrifying. Aunt Susan was very bold. After confirming that he was unconscious, she dragged him to the straw mat and carefully sized him up. From this person's military uniform and boots that didn't fit his feet, she made her own judgment of this person's identity. During those days, the capital of Tianjin was filled with gloomy military police and plainclothes from the Royal Intelligence Agency. The royal family was wantonly searching for remnants of the aristocratic rebellion. Aunt Susan thought that the black-haired young man covered in blood on the straw mat was definitely a noble being hunted down. In the end, what confirmed her judgment was a corner of the black-haired young man's underwear exposed at his waist. As a young lady of the aristocratic family, she was very clear about the material of that underwear. Only the truly wealthy upper-class aristocrats were qualified to use it. Aunt Susan now seemed to have forgotten the tragedy of her family's destruction. She didn't have much hatred for His Majesty and the royal family, nor did she have the courage to involve herself in the aristocratic rebellion and capture a fugitive. At that time, her first reaction was to call the police. However, at that moment, the unconscious black-haired young man woke up for a brief moment. It was in that moment that his small eyes revealed a weakness that aroused endless pity, amiable sincerity, and sincere pleading. He didn't know what kind of struggle Aunt Susan had experienced at that time. He didn't know if she saw the shadow of her parents in this poor fugitive nobleman, or if she remembered that her brother who loved her the most also had such a pair of clear eyes. She didn't call the police. She hid him in the attic of the small courtyard, hiding him in the dust. She fed him plain porridge and water, helped him clean his miserable body that was full of wounds, crushed the pills and stuffed them into his mouth until he woke up. The black-haired young man's first words of thanks after waking up made Aunt Susan confirm her guess again. How many years had it been since she heard that standard Tianjin aristocratic, no, to be more precise, royal accent? This little guy's parents must be important figures. Aunt Susan was busy in the kitchen downstairs. The kitchen knife made chopping sounds on the plastic chopping board and muttered with a trace of annoyance. But what's the use of aristocrats? You can't eat it. You only know how to speak elegantly, but you don't even know how to turn a screw. The cheap vegetables bought in the market during the day were chopped into pieces by the old kitchen knife and thrown into the pot of porridge. Together with a few slices of meat and a spoonful of yellowish-brown spices, the pot of steaming, appetizing chowder was ready. Aunt Susan clapped her hands proudly. When she was about to put the food in the pot on the plate, she suddenly thought of the poor noble's pale face in the attic. After a long silence, she couldn't help but sigh deeply. She took out the black feather chicken and red oranges that she had prepared for her son on the weekend from the refrigerator and threw them into the pot. In the future, I can't be such a good person anymore. There's no benefit, and I have to live in fear every day. As she stirred the food, she wiped the sweat on her forehead and blamed herself. Black feather chicken and red oranges are good for replenishing blood. You picked them out and ate them. Aunt Susan angrily threw the small bowl in front of the black-haired young man and said, "Quickly take care of your body, woman, and then get the hell out of here." The black-haired young man held the bowl that was slightly hot. After a long silence, he slowly picked up the chopsticks and began to eat. After finishing the food in the bowl, he raised his head and looked at Aunt Susan, who had been leaning against the pillar. He seemed to want to say something, but in the end, he didn't say anything. Perhaps it was because the food was too hot. That pair of small eyes that still had some traces of swelling were sparkling. "Don't look at me like a puppy. The remaining half of the chicken is for Paul." Don't expect me to cook it for you. Aunt Susan grumpily snatched the bowl away. The black-haired young man looked at her and chuckled. But don't be in a hurry to leave. Aunt Susan couldn't stand the poor aristocrat's clean and harmless smile. She waved the rag in her right hand as if she wanted to wave the smile away. She said in a serious tone, I heard that recently there were fugitives from the Federation who ran out. Of course, the Joint Defense Office didn't say anything. It's gossip from the underworld. The military and police are looking for people everywhere. You have to be careful. I'm not from the Federation. I'm not afraid, the black-haired young man replied. Not afraid? If the military catches you, a fugitive aristocrat, I'm afraid your end will be much worse than that of the Federation's. Aunt Susan said in a rough voice, Forget it. You can stay here for a while. The household registration check here has never been strict. Who knows how many fugitives are hidden in the 4 major markets? They won't be able to find you in a short time. You can say that you're a distant relative of my family, but... Aunt Susan frowned and looked at him. You have to change your accent. This is an authentic royal accent. She sighed and took the utensils to wash. Before she went downstairs, her rough voice sounded again. You have to be more familiar with the way of life. I don't expect you to make money for me, but you can't live off your parents in the future. You have to learn some skills to make a living, right? Seeing Aunt Susan turn out of the attic like a moving and rotating bucket, hearing the heavy footsteps below, and then hearing the familiar and kind cursing in the kitchen, Sulu rubbed his black hair. His heart was filled with endless warmth and gratitude. He had a lot of dreams and nightmares when he was in a coma. The most frightening dream was when he woke up and saw the cold muzzles of countless Empire soldiers pointing at him. The heavy wolf Fong Mek was guarding the periphery, and Huai Chaosher was slowly walking toward him with a cold face. He didn't expect that when he woke up, he would be greeted by a bowl of warm porridge and a very kind and gentle aunt who looked fierce on the outside. This was really the luckiest thing in life. He was very grateful to this Empire woman named Susan, but on some issues he had to lie to her and acquiesce to her guess. He pretended to be a poor young noble wanted by the Empire regime. The kind Aunt Susan could take the risk to take in a noble because of her past and her sympathy, but she was certainly unwilling to take in a person from the Federation. After waking up, he found that he was mistaken for a noble of the Empire, and this misunderstanding was very firm in his aunt's heart. Sulu also felt a little strange. It was not until now that he remembered that his Empire language was basically learned from Huai Chaosher. With the standard royal language and pronunciation of the princess, it was difficult not to be misunderstood. Aunt Susan's son, Paul, was studying at the second university. Her daily life was very lonely, so she seemed to be a little naggy. And Sulu deduced a lot of things from her nagging, some of which he had learned from Huai Chaosher but didn't pay attention to. In the past, the Empire's social class division was very strict. The royal family, the nobles, the civilians, the lowly, and the slaves formed the layer structure of this abnormal society. And to distinguish whether a person was a noble or not, there was a not very reliable but widely spread method among the people, that was to look at the color of the person's hair and eyes. The closer the color of the hair and eyes were to black, the more noble the identity of the person was. Sulu thought of Huai Chaosher's dark eyes that were always squinting and couldn't help but frown. That year in the Qingqing prison of the Federation, it seemed that the great old man said something vaguely related, but it was too long ago to remember clearly. It seemed that the old man said, if you can remove the chip, you can go to the Empire and pretend to be a member of the royal family? Could it be that the old man had already guessed that he could remove the chip from the back of his neck because of his black hair and shiny black eyes? Su Li's frowning brows gradually relaxed, but his eyes narrowed. He slowly moved his body and leaned on the windowsill, looking at the moon outside the attic that should be strange but was similar to the Federation's moon. His mind drifted away. The sound of testing came from the dilapidated small courtyard below the attic. The ants seemed to be playing a war movie. The metal box hanging at the entrance of the small courtyard should be the chip monitoring device that the Empire distributed to all families for free. That box never rang. Sulu subconsciously reached out and touched the back of his neck. The tiny wound had already healed. He understood that it was because the box never rang that Aunt Susan and Paul never suspected that he was a member of the Federation. But I am a member of the Federation. I have to leave the land of the Empire. What should I do? Su-Lu narrowed his eyes at the moon in a foreign land and fell into contemplation again. I don't know how the Empire's search is going. They haven't found me for so long. Will they think that I am dead? No, according to the temperament of the princess, she will not give up until the body is found. This shabby little courtyard could be considered a decent building in this slum area, but because it was too close to the crematorium, not many people were willing to choose to live here. The surrounding buildings were all dark, and the silence was just like his mood at the moment. Su-Lu withdrew his gaze, shook his head, and sat back on the straw mat. He dragged out a big box from the corner, picked up the rough tools, and began to seriously assemble the inferior and cheap pirated video player. The big problem of escaping from the Empire and returning to the Federation couldn't be solved in a short time, but he had to solve the most troublesome problem in front of him first. But this snapper is really the wrong model, Aunt. He looked at the screws with a bitter face and found that this problem was more troublesome than escaping. Chapter 619. The next day, after a sincere exchange of technical terms, Aunt Susan finally acknowledged the young aristocrat's judgment. With the resentment of the palace above her head, she went to the upper house and exchanged the appropriate components with a verbal battle of words. Since then, Su-Lu, the war hero of the Federation, began his long career as an illegal assembly worker in the slums of the Empire's capital. He used the brain of a mechanic who designed the mech to design the wiring of the simple player, and used the fingers of a mechanic who repaired the mech to install the crude imitation components. Accompanied by dim lights and dark moonlight, he worked day and night without rest. This is a 6-jumper cable. The sensitivity value of the power induction brake switch must be adjusted. According to the voltage stability of this block, if we follow the original design, I am afraid that we will have to restart 30 times to watch a movie. This yellow silicon particle box is the decoder stabilizing valve. The most critical part of the entire player is the decoding device. There are professionals responsible for the software. We don't have to worry about it, but we can expand the transmission rate of the storage channel as much as possible. Decoding rate? If it can be hard decoded, of course, the effect will be much better than soft decoding. But the problem is that even if we want to invade the computing frequency of the main chip, we still need a special hardware device. Cost? I'm not very clear about this. It will probably account for 7% of the cost. Su-Lu explained to the mother and son beside him while quickly flipping his 10 ordinary fingers. He easily and quickly assembled the player in front of him and then put it in a basket on the side. Aunt Susan's eyes widened. She suddenly realized that she had misjudged the poor young aristocrat. His skill level was comparable to a skilled technical worker. Thinking of the hard decoding that this guy just mentioned, she scratched her head and asked in a rough voice, I don't understand these technical terms, but if you can make the high-definition picture smoother, 7% of the cost should not be a big problem. Brother, your work is so beautiful. I can't learn it. Aunt Susan's son, Paul, was on vacation today. He rushed back home from the second university. Like his mother, this young man was also extremely kind and full of sympathy. He had never opposed his mother's move to take in this exiled aristocrat. Today, Paul wanted to learn how to assemble machines from this young aristocrat so that his mother's life could be easier. However, he didn't expect that the young aristocrat's 10 nimble fingers would greatly hurt his self-confidence. Su-Lu smiled, revealing his neat white teeth, and said, I have some talent in this area. Although it was only the simplest assembly process, with the help of the talented exiled noble, the pirated video player produced by Aunt Susan's courtyard was more stable, smoother, and clearer than the players of other competitors. More importantly, the decoding rate was incredible. With excellent performance, the player assembled by Aunt Susan gradually made a name for itself in the market industry. There were more and more repeat customers. Even the butlers of some noble houses in the city center came to buy it for their young masters. It was said that those young aristocrats were completely obsessed with the perfect restoration effect of this set of players on 3D. They couldn't stop themselves, and their hands were sore and their backs were aching. The business was getting better and better, and the money she earned was getting more and more. Aunt Susan simply took out a large sum of money to bribe the market management office and the fierce ruffians. She rented a small shop in the market and hired a middle-aged woman salesperson. From then on, she officially bid farewell to the restless life of a mobile vendor. Nearly 2 months had passed, and the empire had entered the winter rain season. The food in the dilapidated and clean small courtyard was getting more and more abundant. Aunt Susan's hearty laughter was getting more and more frequent. Paul returned home more and more often. However, Sue had been staying quietly in the attic and had not stepped out of the small courtyard. It was windy and rainy outside, and the empire's people certainly did not relax their search for him. He began to ask Aunt Susan and Paul about the movement outside from time to time, but he did not try to go out of the door. The cold, icy rain gently knocked on the window. The small courtyard, which had paid enough heating fees this year, was as warm as spring. After dinner, the three people began to play cards in the attic to pass the time. This had become a routine program in the small courtyard. They were playing Imperial South Road flower cards. From time to time, Aunt Susan's laughter and Paul's morning voice sounded in the quiet attic. Sue smiled and played cards with the mother and son, but he knew very well that the mother and son were worried that they would get sick if they were confined in the attic for too long. Paul lost this game. The young college student rubbed his brown hair angrily and began to shuffle the cards. At this moment, Aunt Susan suddenly said, "You don't have to worry about implicating us. The people in this neighborhood we live in have always only cared about their own family affairs and are not interested in other people's affairs." Sulu was silent. He didn't expect Aunt Susan to guess his worries. I went to the Joint Defense Office and quietly looked at the wanted document. There is no three-dimensional image of you in the noble list. Maybe those officials have long forgotten about you, an inconspicuous little guy. Aunt Susan looked into his eyes seriously. You can't hide in the attic all your life. These days, you often look out of the courtyard. I know you want to leave, but Aunt wants to say that if you want to leave, it's best to leave when you are sure you can leave. Paul also stopped shuffling the cards, looked at Sulu and frowned. Brother, there are many speculations about the truth of this rebellion in the school. Mom and I have asked you many times, but you refuse to say. Naturally, there are reasons that are inconvenient to say, but Mom is right. You'd better not take risks. Aunt Susan was silent for a moment, and then said again with a smile, "Remember to at least tell us when you leave." "Sure," Sulu replied very seriously. The city in the winter rain was like silk, like the dilapidated buildings in the slums shrouded in smoke. These were all the scenes that Sulu watched quietly by the window. Although this small courtyard was so warm, he didn't belong here after all, and had to leave eventually. He didn't know what the situation of his hometown federation was now. Had the troops attacked? Had the guys in Group 7 already gone to the battlefield with guns? What kind of situation were those dear friends in? On the third day after that night's conversation, he carefully dyed his black hair into light brown with the hair dye bought by Aunt Susan, carefully trimmed his eyebrows, put on the color-changing contact lenses bought by Paul, and walked out of the small courtyard for the first time. Gradually, the friends in the market who were familiar with Aunt Susan, and the few neighbors in the streets, knew that a poor relative had come to Susan's house to seek refuge. The people living in the capital city of Tianjin had a natural sense of pride. Even if they lived in the slums, it was still a slum where they could see the towering palace walls from afar. In the eyes of the country people, the slums where they could feel the aura of Her Majesty up close was still a great place. Such scenes of seeking refuge were played out countless times every day. Who would care about the strict household registration inspection system of the empire? In this quiet life, the continuous winter of icy rain passed, and the charming spring came and went. The life of the people in the slums repeated over and over again, as if nothing had changed. Su Li's life was the same. He assembled pirated video players in the attic, accompanied Aunt Susan at night to talk about her emotional past, and occasionally gave Paul pointers on the difficult problems in the university's mechanical department. His life was as steady as a river that didn't flow, a lake that hadn't yet filled. In fact, he wanted to leave, but he couldn't. Under the cold gaze of those hidden in the winter rain and spring breeze, he couldn't leave through the normal route. The Empire's ordinary shipping system couldn't get close at all, so he could only try to get close to the Empire's underground society and use the smuggling channels of those dark forces to leave the planet. However, before his plan could start, he was stunned to find that this route had been completely cut off long ago. Through the idle chatter of the neighbors and the discussions that Paul brought back from campus, he knew the whole story. A few months ago, the Empire's military department suddenly sent a cold final notice to the underground world of Tianjin through the relevant channels, ordering those dark forces to immediately stop all smuggling operations immediately. Such a situation rarely happened in history because the people in power knew very well that these underground worlds were in existence that the entire empire couldn't completely erase from the roots. These underground world smugglers often represented the secret interests of those great aristocrats and even members of the royal family. What's more, it was extremely difficult for them to immediately stop all smuggling transactions. Sure enough, with the support of those royal family members and great aristocrats, the underground world of Tianjin did not immediately stop the military department's request. What followed was a bloody massacre that made the entire empire's underground world tremble. All the smuggling spaceships that dared to leave the surface of the planet were coldly destroyed by the military fleet before they could break through the atmosphere. The warships that fired thousands of cannons didn't seem to care about what goods those spaceships were carrying or which family they belonged to. The biggest smugglers were secretly arrested by the Imperial Anti-Smuggling Department on the same day, and no one saw them again. As for their smuggling base, under the powerful firepower of the Empire's military, it was turned into a pile of broken building blocks made of countless corpses. The most shocking part of the rumor was that the royal family members and aristocrats behind the smugglers were unceremoniously invited back to the dark courtroom by the Imperial Intelligence Agency officials. No aristocrat dared to resist because it was said that His Highness personally led the team. Most people in the Empire's society didn't understand why the royal family would think of a bloodbath in the underground world and spend so much effort to crack down on smugglers. Some people linked this incident to the aristocratic rebellion not long ago, but one person knew very well that all this was just to cut off the possibility of him escaping. Huai Chaosher, you're really ruthless. Su Lu walked through the muddy market, haggling with the vendors who were covered in mud as he collected the fish in a basket with a smile on his face. Suddenly, he raised his head and narrowed his eyes as he looked at the majestic imperial palace in the distance, feeling helpless and disappointed in his heart. Chapter 620. An engineer's way of thinking was very logical. It was okay to make bold assumptions, but one had to be careful when seeking verification. When the object of research was a non-repeatable life, one would be even more careful when seeking verification. Before he was certain, Su Lu would definitely not take risks because of the desire in his heart and the vague hope that seemed to exist. The Federation should be in the summer or autumn of the 71st year of the constitutional calendar. It was spring on the Empire's Tianjin planet. While he was here, he was thinking about the summer and autumn on the other side. He lived quietly in the slums. Looking at the ordinary slums of the Empire who were busy day after day and thinking about his own situation, he suddenly seemed to be able to understand how they felt. The universe was so big and so beautiful that they could only stay on the surface for the rest of their lives unless they went to war. Just like the people of the Eastwoods district back then, they were still bound by heavy gravity and life even though they were in the magnificent space age. He was not very familiar with his neighbors, but he could exchange a few words with them. Not many people could remember his extremely ordinary face, but the vegetable vendors that he frequented had already started to leave vegetables for him. The longer he lived in the capital of the Empire, the stranger Su Lu felt. These extremely ordinary, irritable, and honest people of the Empire would occasionally talk about the distant space war. When they mentioned the people of the Federation, they would always become abnormally angry and want to eat all the men of the Federation alive and snatch all the women of the Federation to be their wives. Where did this anger and fanaticism come from? Was it an invasion in textbooks, or a racial hatred that had been passed down for many years? These vegetable sellers, vegetable buyers, protection fee collectors, protection fee payers, old people, young people, men, women, and the ordinary slums of the empire were all the Federation's irreconcilable enemies? Sulu really found it hard to associate these people with beasts. He could not understand. Was it this group of people who slaughtered the Federation civilians like pigs and dogs on the Westwoods? War should not only make women go away, it should also make civilians go away. Leaving Aunt Susan's dilapidated courtyard more and more often, he walked further and further away at will. Often, he would subconsciously pass by the courtyard whose walls were painted all white. In fact, this was not a subconscious action. This courtyard occupied a very large area. The buildings in the courtyard were not tall and did not exceed 3 floors. Looking from afar, they were basically all luxurious wooden structures. Whether it was the walls or the wooden pillars, they were all painted white. It was so white that it made people feel solemn. The white courtyard was surrounded by tall trees, and there was a faint fragrance of flowers coming from inside. The streets outside the courtyard were extremely clean, and there were many soldiers in plain clothes looking around vigilantly in the shadows, which made them seem somewhat out of place in this slum that was full of dirt and garbage. Sulu would often pass through half of the alley. Every now and then, he would see ordinary citizens of the empire kneeling on the flagstones outside the white courtyard, prostrating themselves on the ground and murmuring pious and fanatical prayers. Nobody dared to disturb them. One day, after buying 2 cans of metal adhesive in a hardware store, Sulu walked through the alley and came to a restaurant that sold caviar. He bought 2 packs of caviar, but did not leave immediately. Instead, he ordered an unknown light drink and sat on the seat facing the street on the 2nd floor. He drank the caviar and ate happily. The corner of his eyes drifted to the white courtyard that he had been observing for a long time. Master Fan Manor. Regarding this Master Fan Manor and the title of the great teacher, there was no record in the Federation's intelligence. He only vaguely remembered hearing the old man mention it once. But according to his understanding, especially the story told by Huai Chaosher, he knew very well what this Master Fan Manor and the great teacher inside meant to the empire. He did not know what kind of person the current great teacher was, but he knew that this courtyard was related to the imperial family of the empire's Baijin dynasty through marriage for generations. A certain Master Fan had once crossed the universe and taught 2 students, Li Pifu and Fengyu. To be able to teach 2 such heaven-defying existences, what kind of heaven-defying existence was this person himself? From a certain point of view, the previous owner of this white courtyard could be considered his Grand Master? Looking at this quiet and mysterious manor, even with Su Li's strong will, he could not help but feel a little uneasy. He knew that this place was definitely heavily guarded. He knew that there was definitely an extremely powerful existence in the Master Fan Manor. He knew that he should not have come here to take the risk, but in the end, he still came. This was because he had too many questions in his heart that needed answers. The secret of the bracelet, the secret of the chip replacement, the secret of the 8 rice jinchi, these secrets were very important to his life. More importantly, the great teacher had once crossed the universe and quietly entered the Federation. How did he do it? Where was that amazing spaceship now? The star chart that the old military god had mentioned in prison. Was it the shortcut that Master Fan had taken back then? Su Lu chewed on his caviar and narrowed his eyes as he looked over, not noticing that the crumbs were falling from the corner of his mouth. In the face of the imperial family's tyrannical and even somewhat crazy search and interception operations, he had to safely leave this planet, leave the empire, and return to the Federation. It seemed that he could take the old path that his predecessors had taken, but this path might be even more difficult. Just a few days ago, the Imperial Military Police once again combed through the slums. Although they still did not discover his existence, it already made him feel uneasy. Time seemed to be running out and he was getting more and more nervous. However, to break into this white courtyard and investigate the mysterious Master Fan Manor, from a rational point of view, was not a wise choice. It was more like a suicide mission. This decision was too hard to make. Right at this moment, a huge commotion suddenly came from the streets in the distance. Su Lu was shocked to find that many of the Empire's citizens had put down what they were doing and were rushing over. Gradually, the earth-shattering commotion turned into orderly, angry shouts. Race not destroyed, fight to the end. Kill the Federation. Long live the Empire. Long live the Emperor. Fight to S1. Kill. Autumn of the 71st year of the Federation's constitutional calendar, spring of the 724th year of the Empire's White Hibiscus dynasty's imperial calendar. The Federal fleet, consisting of 1,400 warships, passed through the two giant warp holes in the Night Scorpion Nebula and Gary Corridor at the same time. The Federal fleet easily defeated the Empire's border fleet and headed straight for the Virgo galaxy in the southwestern star region of the Empire. The Third Cosmic War officially broke out. The vast sea of stars that had just calmed down was once again lit up by the flames of war. Chapter 622. That night, Paul rushed home from the second university. His clothes were full of traces of inferior paint. During dinner, he picked up 3 pieces of wheat vegetables in a daze. Finally, he could not bear the puzzled eyes of his mother and Sulu. He put down his chopsticks, lowered his head, and said, "I have signed up for military special training." Aunt Susan took a deep breath in surprise, covered her mouth, and did not speak. Sulu looked at Paul's young face, hesitated for a moment, and persuaded, "Now the Federation has just passed through the space channel, and the situation is not so tense. You are a mechanical college student. How can it be your turn to fight? I have to be prepared at all times." Paul replied very seriously, "Brother, I know you have resentment against the Empire. In fact, we do too. The problem is that our country has reached a moment of life and death. Our compatriots are trapped in blood and fire. Brother, forget the hatred related to political conspiracies." He patted Su Li's shoulder and said with emotion, "We are not fighting for His Majesty, but for ourselves." Aunt Susan slowly put down the spoon in her hand, and a proud and gratified expression flashed across her chubby face. She put her hand on her son's thin shoulder and said in a gentle voice, "Do what you want to do." Paul nodded hard. Sulu was silent, looking at the young man of the Empire beside him and thinking that he might walk on the battlefield full of blood and fire. He was a little nervous. He wanted to teach him some life-saving skills on the battlefield, but on second thought, wouldn't this be too irresponsible to his compatriots? Sulu was a foreign young man who had saved his life and had a very good relationship with him. Now he was about to enter the battlefield. Perhaps one day he would hold a gun barrel and spit at him, and then cry as they bid each other farewell. Generally speaking, Sulu should be very depressed and struggling with a headache. However, since he had seen too many scenes of comrades dying or surviving by luck on the battlefield in the Westwoods, especially this time when he was captured by the Empire, Su Li's personality changed, or it could be said that he returned to the psychological state of the orphan on Zhonglo Street in Donglin. For problems that could not be solved temporarily, not only could he not think about it, but he was also full of confidence with a sly aura. He believed that if that day really came, he would definitely be able to find a solution. Paul was busy with military training and parading in the streets. Aunt Susan was busy making money and then changing the money into hard currency that was not easy to depreciate. Sometimes, she would go to the management office to give wartime gifts. Su Lu, a soldier of the Federation, did not have the consciousness of being their enemy. He still repaired pirated video players and polished all kinds of inferior metal devices as usual, living a quiet and warm life in the small courtyard and attic. No one knew that when he went to the hardware store every day, he would always sit in the restaurant in the alley next to the white courtyard for a long time. He silently and attentively observed the environment of the house and the movements around it. Then he would memorize everything he saw in his mind. When he returned to the attic of the house, he would draw it on the map. The engineer's meticulous way of thinking made him unusually serious about his preparation work, to the point that he was so serious about every detail. Even so, he still felt that his impulse to enter Master Fan's manor was a little crazy. After all, it was an existence with a taste of history and mystery. And after so many years had passed, who knew where the amazing spaceship that the previous Master Fan had taken was? Was the star map of the third passage between the Federation and the Empire still in Master Fan's mansion? On a calm and impermanent night, the warm fragrance of bean paste buns was steaming under the attic. Aunt Susan was humming one of the most famous and most vulgar online songs in the empire, happily waiting for her son's return. Paul had already finished the special military training at the Second University. If the situation of the universe war in the future developed to be extremely unfavorable to the empire, even the civilians of Tianjin had to join the battle. Paul, who had good grades in the mechanic department, would definitely become a reserve member very much needed by an armored division. Aunt Susan, who had a tragic life, couldn't have any good feelings for the empire's royal family and those dignitaries because of the tragic death of her parents and brothers. In her opinion, this country was undoubtedly a tragic world. But as Paul said to Su Lu, ordinary empire civilians and even slaves, facing the situation of the Federation's large-scale attack, simply put down their hatred for this society in an instant and filled their hearts with love for their hometown, supporting mothers to send their sons to the battlefield with laughter and tears. Su Lu was in the attic, smelling the warm aroma of food from the market below. He shook his head lightly and walked to the window. He glanced at the distant fan manor shrouded in dust and fog, and the new moon that had just risen above the white courtyard. He slowly closed the window tightly, not leaving a single gap. His left foot slightly stepped forward, his right foot pulled back horizontally, his knees bent at a 60-degree angle, his left hand clenched and retracted to his waist, and his right hand stretched out horizontally, but his fingertips curled strangely. He silently maintained this posture for 10 minutes. Then he retracted his feet and changed to another strange posture. These postures were obviously against the common sense of the human body. At the very least, he didn't like the reverse-jointed elbows and knees and the trembling thigh muscles and fibers. These were the 10 postures he had practiced since he was a child. Gradually, trembling was born from the muscles and fibers that were constantly being twisted, squeezed, and rubbed all over his body. Then, it turned into a magical burning power that was hidden under his wheat-colored skin. Following an irregular path, it was transmitted to every part of his body, every finger, every strand of hair, and the tiny holes under each strand of hair. The air in the attic seemed to feel some kind of attraction, and a gust of wind came out of nowhere, slowly flowing around his almost absolutely still body, intimately communicating with the invisible power that seeped out of those pores, rubbing together and then dispersing. The magical power that he had practiced for more than 10 years was silently called the tremor magic when he was a child. Only now did he know that this power actually had a name called 8 rice. However, just as he learned the name, the powerful power in his body was cut off by Huai Caoshi's even more powerful and irresistible power. With his life as a bet, Su Lu fearlessly broke through the seal of that finger, and all the meridians in his body were shattered, turning him into a paralyzed patient. After that, this Donglin stone endured pain that ordinary people absolutely could not endure, and actually forcibly picked up all the scattered power in his body piece by piece. Not only did he recover his original power, he even had a faint leap in some level. Su Lu felt this, but his body was too weak during the escape, and there was no way to know how big the scale of this improvement was. It was not until Aunt Susan saved him and allowed him to stay in the attic that he somewhat inconceivably discovered a lot of problems. He slightly narrowed his eyes, looked at the headphones on the straw mat, slowly raised his hands, and felt the scorching heat spewing out from behind his waist. It no longer followed the previous path, but rushed straight out from the inside of his body like a running bison, rushing over his chest, rushing over his shoulder, rushing over his upper arm, rushing over the tip of his elbow, and rushing into his palm. His palm was still the palm with calluses, but there was a real feeling of swelling filling it, and it seemed to be bigger than what he saw with his eyes. The scorching power was like the air in a balloon constantly pouring into his palm, making his 10 fingers feel swollen and sour, especially the skin of the fingertips became very sensitive, as if he could feel the slightest flow in the air. Su Lu suddenly frowned, softly groaned, and stretched out his 10 fingers in the air suddenly flicked. A series of slight crackling sounds suddenly sounded in the air, as if some kind of invisible power was penetrating the air, and the headphones on the straw mat 2 meters away from him strangely moved their position in a very strange way. A cool and refreshing wind reverberated in the attic, stirring up a few strands of dust that he usually did not pay attention to. Su-lu slowly opened his mouth wide, revealing a mouth full of neat white teeth. He pulled back his hands in front of him, carefully and seriously and shockingly and admiringly, like an engineer admiring the beautiful electron beam that he could never analyze with his intelligence. This was not the first time that he had discovered the so-called Junchi overflow phenomenon, but he was still deeply shocked. Opening the window again, Su-lu looked at Master Fan's mansion in the distance under the moonlight, could not help but shrug his shoulders, put on the headphones, and carefully listen to the communication over there through the electronic pulse monitor. This electronic pulse monitor with a simple appearance was made by the parts he purchased in the hardware store in the past 2 months. With his mechanical skills, it was easy to complete this tool, and it did not let the Imperial Engineering Supervision find any abnormalities. Lifting the straw curtain, prying open the somewhat rotten floor, and taking out a pistol with a metallic luster, Su-lu silently did the final maintenance, and then stuffed the weapon that he hid before he passed out under his clothes. "You don't want to eat?" Aunt Susan looked at him walking down the attic in surprise, waving a spatula, and said, "You don't like bean paste buns? I also made a pot of chowder soup." "There's something that I need to take care of," replied Su-lu with a smile. Aunt Susan had always supported his courage to communicate with the outside world. He had to have the courage to treat the Empire's wanted list as shit, so she did not force him to stay. She continued to wave the spatula and shouted, "The curfew is not strict now, but there are a lot of people on the streets. You have to be careful and come back early." Su-lu walked out of the small courtyard, walked through the alley, stepped on the mud and garbage, and narrowed his eyes as he walked toward the white building. As he walked, he became more and more nervous. "I'm not an ordinary person. Well, people who can use their fingers as engines are generally not human." Chapter 623. Su-lu was an ordinary person who did not take the usual path. However, as a fugitive from the Federation who was crazily wanted by the Empire, he actually dared to carry a gun and charge into the white courtyard alone. Even he himself admitted that the path he chose was a bit too steep. This matter was a bit too crazy. Based on this psychological expectation, when he arrived at the third side door of the Great Master Fan Manor, answered a few simple questions according to the information he obtained from the eavesdropping, and walked in without any obstruction, he could not help but feel a lot of absurd and indescribable feelings. "What are you doing here?" the white-haired butler of the Great Master Fan Manor asked expressionlessly. "I'm here to fix the heating lines." Su-lu swallowed a mouthful of saliva to moisten his somewhat dry throat, and handed over a crudely forged card that he had spent an entire night making. Somewhat unnaturally, he explained, "Last winter, the heating lines in the remote residence exploded twice. The Bureau asked us to hurry up and fix it, so that there won't be any more problems when winter comes." There was still a long way until the next winter. Although it was true that the Bureau had recently sent engineers into the Great Master Fan Manor to do maintenance, Su-lu still felt that this reason was not very tenable, not to mention that the forged card was really easy to see through. Unexpectedly, the white-haired butler did not even glance at the card. He frowned and waved his hand, leading him in. The moment he entered the courtyard and closed the door, Su-lu subconsciously glanced at the dark shadows of the trees outside the Great Master Fan Manor. After observing for several days, he knew very well how many elite forces of the Empire were responsible for the security work in the darkness. If the Great Master Fan Manor discovered that there was something wrong with him, who knew how many bullets would shoot through him? But he just had to enter like this? Just like this, he entered the most mysterious Great Master Fan Manor of the Empire like a joke? Don't make any noise. There are many old scholars in the manor who do historical research. They hate metal, so they also hate the sound of metal colliding. The white-haired old butler clearly did not care about this brown-haired maintenance worker, coldly telling him what to pay attention to. "Don't cough. The people in the manor are all old. They like to cough, so they don't like to hear other people cough. Don't run around. There are no traps in the mansion, and there are no dogs. However, even a cleaner in the mansion has a license to kill. If you make too much noise when you run around, it will affect his mood." Su Lu obediently carried his toolbox and followed behind the butler. He seemed to be carefully listening to these strange and threatening warnings, but in fact, his slightly drooping eyes were constantly sweeping around him. From the outside of Master Fan Manor, he could not see much of what was going on inside. Now that it was rare to enter, he had to carefully examine the terrain and analyze the functions of each area to facilitate his later search or escape again. Don't look around. The white-haired old housekeeper seemed to know what Su Lu was doing without turning his head. Or perhaps it was because every outsider who could enter the Fan Manor in the past couldn't help but look around curiously, so he coldly added this sentence: along the way, all he saw were corners and trees. He didn't see too many valuable things until he entered the pipeline control room in a remote corner. He was left alone. Gently placing the toolbox on the ground, Su Lu looked at the complicated pipeline lines in front of him and frowned deeply. For a full 10 seconds, he did not move at all. He was not confused by the complicated pipelines in front of him. No matter how complicated the mechanical pipelines were, as long as there were corresponding external paint labels, he could sort out the pipeline structure in the shortest amount of time and find the one that needed to be repaired or not. The reason why he frowned and fell into deep thought was the process of entering this white courtyard. Closely related to the Empire's Hibiscus dynasty, the incomparably mysterious Master Fan Manor, he had entered so easily. This fact that had already happened made him feel somewhat inconceivable. There was no strict search, no multiple verification of identity, and even the toolbox at his feet had not been opened. What was the use of those elite troops of the Empire's military outside the manor? He narrowed his eyes and looked at the deep and peaceful night outside the window of the pipeline room and the tall trees swaying gently in the spring breeze. He felt that there was a problem somewhere, but he didn't know where the problem was. He felt that there was something strange hidden in the peaceful courtyard, but he didn't know where it was. Gently and silently exhaling, he squatted down and opened the heavy toolbox to begin his work. Since he had already entered this place, then regardless of whether there was a problem or not, he had to continue walking. He pulled up the historical data on the monitoring screen beside him and found the few pipelines with the least amount of sewage discharge. Then he opened the central valve in the pipeline room and silently placed the high-carbon rods that were sampled and analyzed into each pipeline in order. Among them, there was one pipeline with the least amount of sewage discharge in history, and there was more flocculant inside. Su Li's eyebrows raised slightly and waited for the results of the high-carbon rods to appear on the light screen. Indeed, the sewage discharged from this pipeline did indeed contain the most K2 factor. He had already checked before. K2 was the most commonly used cleaning agent in the high-level libraries of the Empire. The question was, why were there so many flocculant? Could it be that the archive room of the Master Fan Mansion was still using plant fiber books? Although he was hesitant in his heart, there was no hesitation in his actions. He took out 2 rubber pads from the toolbox and stuck them on the pipeline. He pulled out a wire and connected it to a small metal box. Then, he took out a rubber rod and gently knocked on the metal pipeline. No one could hear the sound, but the shock wave produced by the collision between the rubber rod and the metal pipe quickly flowed into the ground along the pipe. It continued to move forward until it reached the exit at the end. Then, it turned back again and entered the rough sonar receiver modified by Su Lu through the 2 rubber pads. The Master Fan Mansion was very big. Su Lu had no way to confirm where the room he was looking for was, so he could only choose this way. After confirming the location of the archive room, he didn't leave immediately. Instead, he took out a low-end rotary screen workbench that was often used by maintenance workers from the bottom of the toolbox and connected it to the cable that he pulled out from the depths of the underground. He wanted to hack into the surveillance system of the Master Fan Mansion. No, to be more precise, he wanted to synchronize with the surveillance system. Although it was easy to enter, and this white courtyard was as unguarded as a brothel, Su Lu was extremely vigilant in front of his teacher's old residence and the most mysterious name in the Empire. He didn't dare to take too many risks, and he didn't believe that he could hack into the other party's surveillance system without being discovered. After putting on the earplugs, he hung the miniature light screen over his left eye, loaded the pistol, and took a deep breath to let the burning power surge through his body. He could use the power of a leopard's speed at any time. After finishing all the preparations, Su tightly closed the door of the archive room. His body suddenly shrank, turned into a shadow, and went out through the window. Then, he hid in the shadows of the flowers and trees. With his current strength, or state, or the speed that he could burst out with, under the cover of the night, it was difficult for a normal surveillance camera to capture his figure. Once he stopped, even if someone walked past him, it would be difficult to discover his existence. He walked in the courtyard like a shadow, carefully avoiding all the dangers and moving towards his target. The Master Fan Mansion was much bigger than it looked from the outside. To reach the archive room, he had to go through a lot of places. On the way forward, there was the sound of the TV news, the sound of arguments, and the unique buzzing sound of tapping on the diaphragm keyboard. These sounds made him feel a little strange. It was as if this courtyard wasn't some mysterious high-ranking official's mansion, but rather a campus full of the smell of youth. On the way forward, he saw a lot of buildings, and the outer walls of these buildings were all painted white. Even if there were traces of time and wind and rain, it still gave a feeling of cleanliness that made people feel a little cold. He didn't know how many turns he took, but through the branches in front of him, Su suddenly saw a stone wall that wasn't white. His body slightly stiffened and stopped in his tracks. There were a few lines of scribbled words on the stone wall. A person with a pure heart has a boundless future. He narrowed his eyes, thinking that the guy who founded the Master Fan Mansion must have been an artistic youth who needed to be cured. The people of the Federation kept criticizing the big shots of the Empire, so he didn't notice that below the line of Empire characters, there was a line of smaller words. There was no trace of light in the room, no sound, and no one. There was only the faint smell of plant fiber moisture resistance medicine and the unique low electric current of the disk array. There should be countless old books and a huge amount of electronic data stored inside. Su's eyes narrowed again, and his eyelids were a little dry. He observed for a long time in the dark, and confirmed that this all-alloy room didn't have any overly heaven-defying security measures. Su used a tool to deactivate several of the triggering alarm systems. Then he crouched before the dark door and spent 3 minutes unlocking the door. Slowly, he pushed open the door, revealing a small gap. Then he slipped in. He was more grateful than ever for the lock knowledge that the uncle taught him. At the same time, he confirmed once again that as long as he wanted to, he could become the most amazing thief in the universe at any time. Some pride and contentment surged into his mind, but it was immediately frozen by the scene in front of him. As far as the eye could see, the room was filled with black cloths. These thick black cotton cloths had a light blocking rate of about 100%. They hung from the ceiling and draped down to the ground. They were like black space partitions, forcibly cutting the three-dimensional space into countless small compartments. Su looked at these black cloths in surprise. Looking at the books and discs in the grid formed by the black cloths, he vaguely understood that the black cloths were probably used as partitions, but he didn't know why they were like that. He didn't have much time. First, he quickly browsed through the paper books on the bookshelves, and found that there should be many secrets of the Empire in them, but they were of no use to him. He flipped through 4 black cloths in a row, but the result was still the same. Somewhat relaxed, he casually lifted a black cloth again, but a light flashed into his eyes. Su's eyes narrowed, knowing that he wouldn't be able to put down the black cloth in time. His right hand pulled out a pistol like lightning, and his finger pressed the trigger tightly, aiming at the back of the figure behind the black cloth. It was the back of a middle-aged man. Chapter 624. Before entering Master Fan Manor, Su had spent dozens of days observing and eavesdropping. From his disguise to a series of detailed problems, he had made ample preparations. The details decided everything, and the details seemed to have decided that he could enter so easily. Although he had made so many preparations, he still didn't have the slightest bit of confidence. This was because this white manor was unknown in the Federation, but to the Empire, it was too important. The smell of history was too strong. The bracelet he had come into contact with when he was young, and the story of Twilight in the Palace City made him particularly cautious of this place. because of this kind of psychological preparation, even if there was an electromagnetic cannon hidden behind the black cloth, or dozens of invisible mecha that were far beyond the level of modern technology suddenly popped out of thin air, he might not be surprised. But the scene before his eyes shocked him so much that he could not speak, and his body stiffened. Whether it was the Federation or the Empire, their history was written by a combination of pen and gun. At this moment, his hand was tightly gripping the cold metal gun, and the muzzle of the gun was aimed at the man who casually asked about Schiller's novels. That was the content of the novel, the pen and the words. It was very different from the current atmosphere, as if a wandering poet had suddenly appeared on a bloody battlefield. It was either pretentious or stupid. I've read many of Schiller's novels, but I don't have much of a literary opinion. Su Li's footsteps were soft and silent, and he expressionlessly took 2 steps forward. The muzzle of the gun was pressed against the back of the man's head. The strange feeling made him subconsciously lower his voice as he answered. The middle-aged man wore an extremely ordinary thin coat. The hem was a little long, and it covered his legs and knees. The room was warm like spring, so he wasn't afraid of the cold. He didn't seem to feel the cold metal gun at the back of his head. He scratched his head, put down the pen in his hand, and turned back with a frown. Reckless men like you who only know how to fight have never studied comparative literature or genre literature. My question was a little redundant, but since you've read so much, quickly recite a few of my novels. The Empire's collection of information is still problematic. Those idiots sent by the military always think that novels are not serious business. They only know how to draw maps. There are still a few of Schiller's early novels that haven't been collected yet. Su Li looked at the face of the middle-aged man under the muzzle of the gun. His finger on the trigger couldn't help but tremble slightly. He didn't know why, but he had a strong urge to blow this face into pieces. It wasn't because this face was too ugly, too wretched, or too frivolous. It was because this face was too beautiful. Su Li had seen many handsome men in his life. There was no need to mention the delicate and pretty by Magnolia and the gloomy Li Qishao for the time being. Shi Qinghai, who had a mesmerizing face and peach blossom eyes, was his best friend. He had enough tolerance for a man with a beautiful face, but at this time he was almost unable to suppress the jealousy and hatred in the depths of his heart. This man from the Empire had a head full of white hair. He was not young, but his face was so perfect that it made people jealous. He was even closer to the category of monsters than Mr. Shi. It was enough to make all the men hate him and feel that the creator was a bastard. Don't tremble with your fingers. The middle-aged man from the Empire tried to move the gun barrel away from his forehead, but he found that Su Li's hand was very tight. He helplessly gave up the idea and said innocently, "I know that many male animals have the urge to destroy my face when they look at it. But this has nothing to do with me. It's my parents. To be more precise, it's a biological mark passed down by some ancestor." He continued with emotion, "The greatest tragedy in the world is to destroy beautiful things and display the process for others to see. I admit that my face is the source of countless tragedies." Su Li's knuckles turned slightly white as he gripped the gun. He found that this mysterious man in front of him was not only ridiculously beautiful, but also nag and narcissism to an outrageous extent. "Who exactly are you?" He knew that his question didn't have much power because it was too cliché, but this was the question he was most nervous about at the moment. "This is Master Fan's mansion." The man from the Empire looked at him with a smile. His bright eyes were unusually charming, and even the few wrinkles at the corners of his eyes had an indescribable feeling. "So?" Su Li's thick eyebrows raised slightly. "So, I am naturally the great teacher." According to the background introduction of Huai Caoshir's story, the great teacher was a great title that was inherited by a certain family. This family of unknown origins helped the Huai family establish the Hibiscus dynasty, and for more than 700 years, they had been hiding behind the scenes to support the royal family's rule over the vast star region. Every great teacher naturally became the teacher of the empire's emperor, so the title of great teacher gradually became an actual position. This kind of existence was definitely amazing, especially when he knew that the former great teacher had taught Li Pifu and Feng Yu, the pair of brothers. Su-la no longer doubted this point. He had thought that the current great teacher might have 3 heads and 6 arms as thick as thighs, but he didn't expect that when he really met him, he would still be severely shocked. "All right, I admit that I'm not a guest." Su-la took a deep breath to calm himself down. His finger that was stroking the trigger relaxed, but he was ready to pull at any moment. He intimately pressed the muzzle of the gun between the beautiful face's eyebrows and said with a slightly hoarse voice, "I seem to have to admit that you seem to know that I was coming and have been waiting for me. But the problem is, do you know who I am? The entire empire is looking for you." Great Teacher Fan smiled and replied, "But other than His Majesty and Xiao Shi, probably no one knows your true identity. But if others don't know, how can I not know? Please try to be concise." Su-la gradually calmed down. He twisted his lips and pressed the muzzle forward without hesitation. The great teacher frowned because of this action. He then stood up, as if he wasn't worried that Su-la would pull the trigger at all. He waved his hand and said, "You are Nasri's son, so you should be Jian Shuair's half-brother. Based on this relationship, you should also call me uncle. Is it popular in the Federation to point a gun at one's uncle's head and shout kill? Well, if we don't start from my poor sister, or from my poor father who died in the hands of an old man, Nasri and I are brothers. I am the disciple of the sect leader. Does the Federation have such a cute title?" Listening to the middle-aged man in front of him talking nonstop, Su-la suddenly felt as if all the sounds in the room were being absorbed by the black cloth that was everywhere. He couldn't hear anything at all, but the words were clearly transmitted into his mind. There were too many plots and clues in a few simple sentences. It was so complicated that even his logical brain was a little confused. "Wait, this is a little too complicated. You have to let me sort it out first." Su-la reached out his left hand with a headache, indicating for the other to stop. "Oh, the relationship between the great families has always been very complicated. If you are interested, you can study the history," the great teacher continued excitedly. Su-la helplessly moved the muzzle of the gun down a little and blocked the great teacher's mouth. With an extremely serious expression, he said, "Let's start from the beginning. You said that Jian Shuair has to call you uncle. Does that mean that her mother is your elder sister or younger sister?" Logically speaking, the great teacher, who should be incomparably honorable and serious, was now squeezing his extraordinarily beautiful face, ignoring the cold muzzle of the gun in his mouth, and vaguely explaining, "I said that she is my elder sister." "So your elder sister is the former great teacher's younger daughter? Then what are you?" Su-la thought of the story that Huai Chaoshi had told him and asked in confusion. The muzzle of the gun subconsciously moved away. "She is the younger daughter, and I am the younger son. This relationship is very simple. The former great teacher is my father, and my elder sister is my father's daughter. Isn't it natural? So, Jian Shuair and Huai Chaoshi are half-sisters." Su-la opened his small eyes wide and came to an incredible conclusion. The great teacher looked at him and nodded. He spread his hands and said, "Jian Shuair made His Majesty wear a green hat. Otherwise, why would he go crazy whenever he saw Jian Shuair? But you don't have to worry too much about the incestuous relationship between you and Xiao Shi. She and Jian Shuair are half-sisters, you and Jian Shuair are half-sisters, and you and Xiao Shi are half-sisters." Su-la felt a headache coming on. The great teacher was focusing on the main point, so he asked, "Then you, the current great teacher of the empire, is Jian Shuair's uncle, and also Huai Caoshi's uncle? I am very proud to have 2 nieces who are the most outstanding in their respective fields," the great teacher said with satisfaction. He waved his arm again, causing the thin coat on his body to flutter in the wind, revealing his bare thighs and a corner of his underwear. Su-la didn't expect this important person to have such a strange habit of dressing. The words he wanted to say were stuck in his throat. He silently thought about these complicated things, and his feelings were indescribable. Of course, he knew that he wasn't the great teacher's son, but it seemed that the empire insisted on this. So these complicated relationships involved him. "I don't think you waited for me just to tell me a story." He narrowed his eyes, not looking at the middle-aged man's thighs. He shrugged and said, "Actually, I don't even know how you guessed that I would be able to escape and enter the great teacher Fan Manarch. I heard that Nasri died. You inherited his legacy, so of course you were able to escape successfully. The great teacher smiled and said, several decades ago, when I was still young, I ordered him as his brother-in-law to find a way to take me to the Federation to play. Only then did he create that little blue thing. Although he didn't keep his word and didn't take me to the Federation, I thought that since you had that little blue thing on you, how could the Empire's surveillance catch you? As for why I guessed that you would come to the great teacher Fan Manor, the reason is very simple. The great teacher completely ignored his pistol and naturally turned to pick up the teacup on the table. His thin clothes fluttered like an immortal, and his two thighs were a shocking sight. Student Huai Fuchai will go completely crazy when he hears the names Li Pifu and Nasri. If you want to live, or even go back, of course you have to find someone to help you. But you're alone in the Empire, who can you find? The great teacher's legs were bare. He smiled and said, after all, we are relatives. Although we don't interact much, we still have to visit each other occasionally. Chapter 625. It was another long paragraph, with the tone of an early Schiller script. Su Lu vaguely understood what this relative of his was trying to convey. Due to the vast relationship between them that spanned across the Federation and the Empire, this imperial master was willing to help him, but he was not willing to put too much effort into it. In other words, he did not have many good methods to deal with the wrath of the imperial family. This paragraph also mentions some things that happened decades ago. The great teacher had clearly wrongly attributed Su Li's ability to escape the surveillance of the imperial chip to the small blue device, not knowing that he had the ability to extract the chip from the back of his neck. What Su Lu was thinking more about was that if the little blue device was the uncle's invention, then the image of the former master's pocket emitting blue light as he traveled around the Federation in her mind was naturally not real. It seemed that imagination was not the truth of history after all. If you are willing to help me leave the Empire, I will be very grateful. He slightly raised his chin, unwilling to look at the middle-aged man's naked legs. After a moment of silence, he continued, I don't have a complete understanding of the things that happened back then, but I believe that since your father could enter the Federation on a spaceship alone, he must have a very impressive spaceship. That spaceship is indeed very impressive. The great teacher lifted his thin shirt and scratched his smooth thighs in an indecent manner. Then he lit a cigarette and took a deep breath. But I don't know where it is. Besides, although the universe is vast, who knows how many Imperial warships are hidden in it? How did you get out? Su Lu was silent again, guessing how much of what the great teacher said was true. He tightened his grip on the gun and then loosened it. Lowering his head, he said, that star map? The great teacher blew out a mouthful of light blue smoke and frowned his good-looking eyebrows. He said self-deprecatingly, if I had a spaceship and a star map, I would have run to the Federation to play by myself. Do you know what a star map is? The middle-aged man's inhumanly handsome face suddenly flashed with a hint of emotion. He held the cigarette in his mouth and gently exhaled the words with the smoke. Li Piffa might know a little, but he doesn't know where the star map is. Our Majesty, student Huai Fucha, knows where the star map is hidden, but until today he does not know the true contents of the star map. As for the other big shots in the Imperium and the Federation, they know nothing at all. In the entire universe, only I know what that star map is, and only I know where it is. Master Fan held the cigarette between his index and middle finger and gently brushed his lush white hair. The smoke entered his hair and lingered for a long time before slowly dissipating. It was like a nebula in the sky, showing a sense of vicissitudes at an unbearably slow speed. Su Lu was still silently holding the pistol, aiming at his head. He listened quietly and didn't say anything unnecessary. He played the role of a quiet listener very well. Because the star map originally belonged to our family. The slightly mocking smile on the master's face gradually disappeared, and he said in a low voice, it passed from my father's hands to my sister's hands, and your father, Nasri, sent the bracelet back to my niece. It can be considered to have returned to the hands of our family. Su Li's eyes slightly froze. He remembered the bracelet he saw on Jian Shui'er's jade wrist. The bracelet was engraved with ancient letters and lyrics. He was shocked to find that the important star map, which had never appeared in historical records and was only silently sought by big shots at the level of military godly Pifu and Lady Tai, had always been in Jian Shui'er's hands. But there was something wrong with this matter. If the bracelet that hid the star map was passed down by Master Fan of the Imperium, why was it engraved with the ancient characters of the Federation? After hesitating for a moment, he raised his question to the beautiful middle-aged man in the smoke. Why is the ancestral bracelet of Master Fan of the Imperium engraved with the ancient characters of the Federation? The great teacher laughed cheerfully. The air he exhaled dispersed the smoke in front of him. The thin coat on his body fluttered uneasily. He raised his leg and stepped on the stool beside him. He praised himself and said, "This is also what I have always wanted to prove." Master Fan stared into Su Li's eyes and said with a charming smile, "At the very beginning, there was no Federation, and there was no Imperium. Both sides came from the same place in the universe, and I have to narcissistically come to a conclusion that our family should occupy a very important place in this period of history." The inference was not complicated, and the conclusion was not narcissistic. Instead, it was very logical. However, there was no shock on Su Li's face. Instead, there was some indifference. He shook his head and said, "Many historians in the Federation are doing research in this area, but in front of the flames of war, this kind of experiment is not very meaningful. Because my ground is higher, the Imperium has to believe what I say," the great teacher said calmly. Su Lu silently agreed with the great teacher's statement. There is a great calamity in the history of the Federation, but what is a great calamity? Have you ever dug up a prehistoric relic underground? Master Fan waved his arm and said disdainfully, "Only you poor mechanical citizens brainwashed by broken computers would not conduct in-depth research on these matters. What do you mean by not very meaningful? I have evidence to prove that both sides are relatives. That is enough." The Federation's current research also believes that the Great Calamity is a disaster for the prehistoric civilization. This point coincides with your thoughts. Su Lu looked at the excited great teacher and said with a shrug, "All right, the Imperium might be a branch of that prehistoric civilization, and our families might be relatives. But where is your evidence? Is the bracelet on my beautiful niece's wrist not evidence? First, you have to show evidence that she is your niece. Look at this face of mine." Master Fan raised his head and forced his face, which could be described as peerlessly beautiful, to come before Su Li's face. Think about Jian Shui'er's face. Where can you find such excellent genes? That does make some sense, Su Lu said with a shrug again, but don't forget that your princess is not very beautiful. There is still a lot of evidence and numerical units. How can there be the same astronomical units and dating methods that are so outrageous in different universes? Be it the Federation or the Imperium, as long as the big shots in power are willing, they can start a comparison work that involves all aspects of human society, Master Fan said sarcastically. Master Fan said mockingly, "It's a pity that what should have been the warmest and most exciting reunion in the history of mankind was directly turned into countless massacres by those greedy mineral merchants of the Federation." The middle-aged man opposite him looked like a licentious playboy, but after all, he was the most mysterious and honorable great teacher in the Imperium. Whether it was his psychological inclination or his position, of course, he was on the Imperium's side. Su Lu had no intention of refuting his ridicule. Why am I so interested in Schiller? Not only because his popular novels in the middle period of his life seemed to me to be the best way for humans to pass the time and survive the hardships of life, but also because I feel that from his works, I can clearly see the similarities between the Imperium and the Federation. There is no one in this world, no one with a brain that can come up with so many plots that require different life experiences, insights, and even extreme insights to write. According to my request, the Imperial Intelligence Agency collected a large amount of Schiller's works. The more I read, the more I feel that the person who can write so many scripts and novels can't be the same person. Su Lu listened to him in silence, feeling a little strange. Regarding this question that had troubled the Federation's Literature Research Institute and the folk celebrity gossip fans for countless years, he suddenly thought of something. Could it be that Schiller really did not exist, and was not a sock puppet of one of the five, but was it written by an old thing? Schiller is not the same person. Great Teacher Fan raised his head slightly, his gaze passing through the smoke and the black cloth to look at the white courtyard outside, the green trees, and the high sky. Or rather, those books were not written by the same person. He was just a narrator. Sulu was still silent. He originally thought that tonight's visit to the Great Teacher Fan Manor was ridiculous, but after the conversation he realized that the owner of this white courtyard was indeed not an ordinary person. Shouldn't you put down your gun? Although we are not related by blood, you still have to call me uncle. The great teacher suddenly changed the topic. What kind of uncle is this? Sulu thought silently in his heart. However, in the Imperium, it was not a bad thing to have such an influential uncle. His father, who had died in a mining accident, seemed to have benefited him greatly. He only hoped that his mother and sister in the underworld would not mind that he had randomly recognized a relative. He put down his gun. This makes me feel much better. I can continue talking about my research over the years. Great Teacher Fan looked at him with an amiable smile and said, "My hobby since childhood has been literature. After obtaining 6 bachelor's degrees from the Imperial University, I finally chose to focus my life on comparative literature research. Comparative literature research between the Federation and the Empire. Yes, I am the only one in this department. From the head of the department to the lecturers to the students, I am the only one. I believe that in the entire universe, I am the only one in this field. It is absolutely unique." The middle-aged man smiled very proudly. Every generation's great teacher was a stunning talent, a figure who was close to a god in their own field. Sulu had long acknowledged this fact, but he really did not expect that this generation's great teacher fan seemed to be a youth, a middle-aged man, or perhaps an old man who was intoxicated by literature. I have written countless unpublished papers to prove that Schiller's novel scripts have many texts that are too similar to each other. In the form of folklore, they are circulated within the Imperium. To prove that two societies came from the same civilization, what kind of similarity is the most important? That is the similarity of cultures. Great Teacher Fan pursed his lips and raised both of his hands as he spoke loudly. His thin jacket slid down his arms and piled up to his shoulders. Paired with his bare legs, he looked like a fanatical religious priest. According to the distant and almost blurred legends, although my ancestor was the biggest war oligarch, he was also the person who hated war the most. I am also the same. My hobby is literature, peace and love. So please allow me to temporarily imprison you in the name of literature, peace and love, the most precious things in my life." As his voice fell, the gradually dissipating smoke dissipated even faster. Su Li's pupils suddenly constricted. His right hand that was still holding the gun vigilantly was just about to raise when several thick bolts of blue lightning broke through the smoke and struck his chest fiercely. You're tuning in to the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.